"Get off my land." Orson Pike didn't shout it. That was the worst part. He said it the way a man says, "Pass the salt," flat, bored, already thinking about something else. He looked at the two children, standing behind Lenora Vance, and let his eyes move over them like they were fence posts. They were nothing. Like hunger on a child's was just weather. Lenora felt her daughter's hand tighten around her fingers. "She didn't move," I said. "I heard you." Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "I'm looking for Briar Hollow Ranch. I was told a man named Gideon Thorne might have work." Pike smiled. It didn't reach anything above his mouth. "Thorne can't afford to feed his own. Can't imagine he'll do better feeding strays." He turned his horse and rode away without looking back. And Lenora Vance stood in the middle of that dirt road with 8-year-old Maisie pressed against her side and 14-year-old Caleb trying very hard not to let anyone see that his hands were shaking, and she thought, if that man is what this valley produces, then God help whatever family opens their door to him. She didn't know yet that Orson Pike wasn't just a rude man on a horse. She didn't know yet that he was the reason she was standing on that road in the first place. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story that makes you feel something, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Stories like Lenora's don't get told enough, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that road in 1880 and to a woman who had nothing left to lose. The suitcase had a broken latch. Lenora had wrapped a strip of leather around it to hold it shut, knotted twice, the way her husband Thomas used to knot his bootlaces, double, tight, no trust given to a single loop. She noticed herself thinking about that as she walked, which told her she hadn't slept properly in 4 days. Your mind goes to strange places when it's running on nothing but fear and forward motion. Maisie hadn't complained once. That scared Lenora more than the complaining would have. An 8-year-old who stopped asking for things has learned, somewhere in her small bones, that asking doesn't work anymore. Lenora looked down at her daughter's face and saw a child doing the math on their situation and coming up with numbers too big for a little girl to carry. Caleb was 14 and doing what 14-year-old boys do when they feel helpless. He was angry. Not at his mother, not exactly. At everything in a general sort of direction. He'd been like that since the funeral, since the bank, since the morning they'd walked away from the farm and he'd picked up his mother's suitcase without being asked and carried it without a word. And Lenora had thought, this is what it costs a boy to become a man too soon. She hadn't wanted that for him. She hadn't wanted any of this. The road to Briar Hollow was unpaved, which she'd expected, and longer than she'd been told, which she hadn't. The man at the general store in Redwater Crossing had said 3 miles, maybe less, and she'd walked what felt like 5 before the fence line appeared through the scrub. Post cedar, some of it leaning, one section tied together with baling wire, where it had clearly given up pretending to be a fence. The gate was open, not broken open, not torn off, just open, like someone had walked through it and not bothered to close it behind them, like they either expected more company or had stopped caring about the distinction between inside and outside. She stood at that gate for a moment. Later she would think about that moment often, about the choice it represented. She could have turned around, could have gone back to Redwater Crossing and slept in the church and eaten charity and taken her children somewhere else, anywhere else, and built something different. A lot of women would have. No one would have blamed her. But the thing about Lenora Vance was that she had a very low tolerance for doors that weren't open, and this one was. She walked through. The ranch house sat at the end of a dirt path that had turned to mud somewhere in the middle and hadn't recovered. The yard looked like a place where intention had outrun follow-through. There was a vegetable garden that had been started and abandoned, a chicken coop that needed mending but still had birds in it, firewood stacked unevenly against the sidewall like someone had thrown it there in frustration. The porch had a soft spot near the second step that she noticed because Maisie's foot went through it to the ankle and Lenora grabbed her before she fell. "Stay behind me," she said. "Both of you." Caleb said nothing. He'd already noticed the soft board. She knocked. Nothing for a long moment. Most of its windows were dark. Then boots on a wooden floor, heavy and uneven, and the door opened to a man who looked like he'd been awake for 36 hours and couldn't quite remember why he'd bothered. Gideon Thorne was not what she'd expected. She'd heard the name in town Thorne, out on the Briar Hollow Road, widower, couple of kids, might have work, and she'd formed a picture in her mind without meaning to. Prosperous rancher, maybe soft around the middle, the kind of man who could afford to be generous because he had so much left over. The kind of man whose charity was comfortable for him. The man standing in that doorway was not comfortable. He was broad through the shoulders, the kind of broad that comes actual work rather than from eating well. And his face had the weathered quality of someone who spends too much time outside and not enough time sleeping. His shirt was clean, but frayed at both cuffs. There was a bruise along his jawline that was going yellow at the edges, 3 or 4 days old. His eyes were dark and careful, and moved from Lenora to Caleb to Maisie, and then back to Lenora in the assessing way of a man who is already calculating things he can't quite afford. He said nothing. She spoke first. "My name is Lenora Vance. I was told you might have work. I can cook, keep house, mend, plant, and do whatever else needs doing. I'm not looking for wages, just shelter and meals for myself and my children." She paused. "I know that's a lot to ask, but I'm asking anyway." Gideon looked at Maisie. Maisie looked back at him with the kind of direct, fearless stare that very young children and very old people have, because they haven't yet learned that there's something threatening about being looked at honestly. "How long since she ate?" he asked. "Not how long since you ate. Maisie, the smallest one, the one who couldn't pretend." "Yesterday morning," Lenora said. "Small amount." He was quiet again. Something moved in his face that wasn't exactly pity. It was more complicated than that, like a man recognizing something he'd already survived. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," he said. It wasn't a warm invitation. It wasn't "come in, we'll get you sorted out. Everything will be fine." It was a man opening a door because he'd already decided, somewhere before he knew he was deciding, that he wasn't the kind of person who closes doors on hungry children. Later, Lenora would think that was the truest thing she ever learned about Gideon Thorne. Not what he said. What he couldn't make himself not do. The kitchen was cold. Not empty, there was food, a modest amount, flour and potatoes, and a joint of something salted and hanging but cold the way a kitchen gets when the person running it has other things on their mind. The fire in the stove had been let go low. There were dishes stacked but not washed, a pan with dried something stuck to the bottom. The general evidence of a household operating on the minimum possible effort required to keep people alive. She counted the evidence the way she counted everything now. Habit, necessity, call it what you want. "Sit down," Gideon said to the children. I'll do it," Lenora said. He looked at her. "You opened the door," she said, not unkindly. "I'll do the rest." He didn't argue. That surprised her. Most men argued. She found a pot and started water, and used some of that flour and the back half of a potato and whatever dried herbs she found in a tin on the shelf, and in 20 minutes she had something that was more broth than soup, but was hot and filling and tasted like effort. She fed Maisie first, then Caleb, and watched them eat with the focused efficiency of children who have learned not to trust food to still be there if you slow down. Then 2 more children appeared in the doorway. She hadn't known about them. That is, she'd known Gideon had children, but knowing and seeing are different things. Most of its windows were dark. These 2 were a girl of about 12, dark-haired and sonora, with a kind of suspicion that a child learns when things have been taken from her, and a boy of maybe 10 who had his father's eyes and his father's stillness and was clearly deciding whether to be polite or honest and hadn't made up his mind yet. "That's Ada," Gideon said from behind her, "and that's Samuel." "Hungry?" Lenora asked them. Ada didn't answer, said, "We ate." Then after a pause, "But it smells good." "Sit down," she said. Same tone she'd used with her own children. Not soft, not hard, just matter of fact, like sitting down was the obvious next step, and only a fool would argue with it. They sat down, and that, she would think later, was the second thing she learned about this place. There were 5 children in this ranch, and none of them trusted anything easily, and all of them were hungry in one way or another for food, for steadiness, for someone to just pick up the dropped thing and carry it without being asked. She could do that. She'd been doing it her whole life. After the children were fed and gone to whatever spaces they'd claimed in the house, Gideon sat across from her at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a while. She didn't fill the silence. She'd learned, after Thomas died, that filling silences was a reflex you could unlearn. if you let yourself sit with the discomfort long enough. You're from east of here, he said finally. It wasn't a question. Ohio, she said, farm outside Coleridge. We lost it in the fall. My husband died in August. By October, the bank had the deed. She said it the way you say facts, because that's what they were, terrible facts. But facts. He looked at his hands. I'm sorry, I know you are. She meant it. She could see it in how he held himself, that particular weight of a person who has lost someone and knows exactly what that loss feels like, and would not wish it on another living soul. You've been there too. He nodded. 3 years. Ada's mother, Elizabeth. He said the name like it still cost him something. After 3 years. She noted that. I'm not looking to stay forever, she said. I need to get my children through winter. Come spring, I'll have enough saved something to move on. Find land. I have a brother in Kansas. Long way to Kansas. I've walked further than I expected already. She paused. I'm not asking you to take care of us. I want to make that clear. I'm asking you to let me work, and in exchange, my children eat and sleep under a roof. That's all. He was quiet for a long time after that. The roof has a leak over the east bedroom, he said. I've slept under leaky roofs. The stove burns hot on the left side. You have to compensate. I'll figure it out. He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, and she had the uncomfortable feeling of being read accurately by someone who didn't have the decency to pretend otherwise. Then he said, I can't pay you, I know. The ranch is, he stopped. Started again. Things are tight. Things are tight everywhere. She looked at the kitchen, the way she'd been looking at it since she walked in, cataloging, measuring, planning without meaning to. But there's work here that could make things less tight. The chicken coop has 4 hens you're not using right. I could see that from the yard. The vegetable patch is dead, but the soil looks good. Got his Vance. She stopped. I know what I've got. His voice wasn't angry. Just tired. The exhaustion of a man who knows the full list of his failures and doesn't need it read back to him. Can't do it all at once. She sat with that. No, she agreed. You can't. But 2 people can do more than one. He was quiet again. Outside wind moved against the house, and somewhere upstairs, one of the children said something, and another laughed, briefly, surprised by itself. Gideon looked up at the ceiling, at the sound like it was something he hadn't heard in a while and didn't know what to do with. Help me with the house, he said finally. In return, your children won't go hungry. It wasn't a generous offer. It was barely an offer at all. It was 2 people in a difficult position, recognizing that their difficulties might cancel each other out. But Lenora Vance had been a farmer's wife, and she understood something that poets never write about. Survival isn't pretty. Survival is standing in a cold kitchen with a stranger and saying yes because the alternative is worse. All right, she said. And neither of them said anything else for a while, and the fire in the stove crackled, and upstairs the children were quiet again, and outside the wind kept moving. She didn't tell him that night what she'd learned in Redwater Crossing before she came. She didn't tell him, the man with the smile, and the bored eyes, and the way of looking at hungry children like they were posts, had been asking about Briar Hollow in this general store, asking who held the debt, asking how far behind the payments were, asking in the polite, casual way of a man who already knows the answers and is just checking to see if anyone else does. She didn't tell him because she didn't have proof of anything, and she'd learned that women without proof who say dangerous things about powerful men have a way of ending up worse off than they started. But she filed it away. In the same place, she filed the broken latch and the double-knotted leather strip and the sound of her daughter's foot going through the soft board on the porch, all the small, dangerous things that needed fixing before someone got hurt. Because Lenora Vance was not, as it turned out, a woman who had arrived at Briar Hollow to be saved. She was a woman who was just beginning to understand what she'd walked into. And somewhere down that muddy road, Orson Pike was riding toward his own evening, easy in his saddle, counting things that weren't quite his yet. The first morning at Briar Hollow, Lenora woke before anyone else. That wasn't unusual. She'd been waking before dawn since she was a girl, since her own mother had pulled her out of bed at 4:30 to start the bread, and told her that the difference between a woman who managed and a woman who drowned was usually just 1 hour of quiet at the start of the day. She'd believed it then. She believed it more now. She lay in the small room they'd given her, a storage room, really, with a cot wedged between shelving units that still held mason jars and a broken harness, and she listened to the house. A house tells you things in the dark that it won't tell you in daylight. She could hear the wind finding gaps she'd need to locate and seal. She could hear a board somewhere upstairs that someone's weight was pressing in sleep, soft, rhythmic creak. She could hear, faint and distant, one of Gideon's cattle doing something restless near the fence line. She got up. She didn't dress slowly or think too hard about it. She put on her clothes and her boots, and she went to the kitchen, and she lit the stove, and she started to learn it. Every stove has a personality. This one, as Gideon had warned, ran hot on the left side. But it also has a draft problem she hadn't been told about. The chimney pulled unevenly, which meant smoke backed up if you loaded it wrong. She figured that out the unpleasant way, with her eyes watering and the kitchen filling with a gray haze that made her cough into her sleeve. She adjusted the damper, tried again. Better. Not perfect, but better, which in her experience was how most things went. By the time Maisie appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket and squinting against the light, there was porridge on and water hot for coffee, and a small pile of things Lenora had already reorganized on the kitchen counter, not because it was her kitchen, she knew it wasn't, but because a disorganized kitchen is a kitchen that wastes food and time, and neither of those things were available in surplus. Is it morning? Maisie asked. It is, it's cold. Come, stand by the stove. Lenora pulled her daughter close and felt the cold radiating off the child's skin and thought, not for the first time, about what it was going to take to get through winter in a house with this many drafts. Better? Maisie nodded against her ribs. Ada appeared next. Gideon's daughter moved through the kitchen doorway, with the wariness of someone walking onto uncertain ground, her dark eyes taking in the rearranged counter and the porridge and the unfamiliar woman standing at her mother's stove. She was 12 years old, and she had spent 3 years being the closest thing this household had to a woman in charge. And Lenora understood immediately that she had just complicated Ada's life considerably. Good morning, Lenora said. Ada said nothing. She went to the cabinet where the bowls were kept and opened it, and paused for a moment because the bowls were stacked differently than they had been yesterday. I moved them lower, Lenora said, not looking up from the stove. Easier to reach. I can put them back if you prefer. Ada considered this. No, she said finally, very quietly. That's fine. It wasn't a welcome. But it wasn't a fight either, and Lenora counted that as progress. Gideon came in 20 minutes later, looking like a man who had slept badly and was pretending otherwise. He stopped when he saw the kitchen, did the same inventory that Ada had done, noticing the arrangement, the fire, the smell of something actually cooked, and something in his face shifted in a way he didn't quite control before it settled back into neutral. You didn't have to do all that, he said. I know. She handed him a cup of coffee. I wanted to see how the stove behaved. He took the cup, looked at it. You found the coffee. Third shelf behind the cornmeal tin. You're almost out. Do you have an account at the general store in town? Yes. Why? I'm making a list. She turned back to the porridge. What's needed? If you're going to let me run this kitchen, I need to know what I'm working with and what I'm not. Quiet for a moment, and she was aware of him standing behind her in the way that you're aware of a large animal that is deciding whether to be friendly, without being certain yet which way it's going to go. You've been here one night, he said. I know that too. Most people, he stopped. Most people wait to be asked. She glanced at him over her shoulder. I'm not most people. You can tell me to slow down if you want. But the chicken coop needs mending before you lose birds to something coming in at night, and that vegetable patch could still produce something. If I get root vegetables in this week, before the ground freezes hard. Most of its windows were dark, and someone has been letting the fire in the front room go out overnight, which is why it takes until mid-morning to warm up in here. He stared at her. Samuel feeds the chickens, he said finally. He's been meaning to fix the coop. Samuel is 10. Capable. I'm not saying he isn't. I'm saying the coop needs fixing today, not whenever a 10-year-old gets around to it. She paused. I can fix it myself if Caleb helps me. Your son can watch and learn if he wants. She said it practically, not unkindly, because she genuinely wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. But she could see by the set of Gideon's jaw that being told about his son's unfinished work by a woman who had been on his property for less than 24 hours was not sitting easily. Fine, he said, that was all. Just fine. And he took his coffee and went outside, and Lenora turned back to the stove, and Maisie, who had been sitting very still through all of this, said in a small voice, "Mama, are you going to make him mad?" "Probably," Lenora said, "but not on purpose." The chicken coop took most of that morning. The problem was a section of the wire mesh along the lower left corner that had been pushed inward by something a fox, most likely, maybe a small coyote, and then half-heartedly pushed back into place, but not secured. The birds had been lucky. One more night, and something would have gotten through. Caleb found the problem and pointed it out before Lenora did, which made her quietly proud. She handed him the pliers and showed him how to twist the wire tight against the frame and told him to work along the whole base to check for other weak spots while she looked at the roof of the coop, which had a small gap at the eave that could let in rain. Samuel Thorne appeared sometime around mid-morning and stood watching Caleb work with an expression that was trying very hard to be unimpressed. "My job," Samuel said. Caleb glanced up. "Do you want it back?" Pause. "I was going to do it." "I know." Caleb said it without aggression. He was 14 and had the social intelligence of someone who had learned recently that most arguments aren't worth having. "We're almost done. You can help with the roof part if you want." Samuel stood there for another moment, calculating something, and then he picked up the hammer that was lying in the dirt and came over and said, without any particular warmth, "The gap's on the right side too." "I already looked." "Good catch," Caleb said, and they worked side by side, without speaking, two boys who didn't know each other and weren't sure they wanted to, but who could at least agree on what needed doing. Lenora watched from the corner of her eye and said nothing. She spent the afternoon in the kitchen properly, this time pulling everything out of the cabinet shelves and inventorying it with a piece of charcoal and the back of an old flour bag. She found 3 things worth noting. There was more dried corn than she'd expected, which was good. There was a jar of something pickled that had gone bad and needed to go immediately, which she handled without ceremony. And there was, pushed to the very back of the lowest shelf, a small tin that rattled when she picked it up. She opened it. Money. Not much, a handful of coins and a few folded bills. Emergency money, the kind you hide from yourself so you don't spend it. She put the tin back exactly where she'd found it, pushed to the exact same position, and she didn't mention it to anyone. But she thought about it. A man who had emergency money hidden in his own kitchen was a man who didn't trust his own spending, or a man who was afraid of something specific coming, a bill, a payment, a particular date. She filed that thought next to everything else she was filing. The first real conversation she had with Gideon that lasted more than 2 minutes happened 4 days after she arrived. She was mending a shirt by the front window, his shirt, left on the mending pile with 2 others, all of them with the same kind of wear at the elbows that told her he never asked anyone to fix them and just wore them until they were past fixing. And he came in from the barn earlier than usual and sat down in the bean chair across from her without apparently meaning to. She didn't look up. He didn't say anything for a while. The fire crackled. Outside, one of the children called to another. She'd stopped distinguishing between her own and his by sound. They'd begun to blur together into a general noise of children that she found, to her own slight surprise, more comfortable than silence. "You're from farming stock," he said. "Not a question. 40 years of it on my father's side." She turned the shirt sleeve. "My grandfather grew wheat in Pennsylvania. Father moved west, corn and soybeans. Thomas, my husband, he grew up on cattle land in Indiana, but switched to crops when we married, because I knew crops, and he knew I was right about most things." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across Gideon's face. Most things. He'd have argued the number down some, but he'd have lost. She bit the thread. "You grew up here?" "North of here, my father ran horses. I switched to cattle," because he paused. "Because horses require a kind of patience I don't have." "You seem patient?" "I seem it." He looked at the window. "What you saw on the road, Pike." She kept her eyes on her work. "What about it?" "I saw your face when you came in. You'd had a run-in with him." She thought about how much to say. She'd been thinking about it for 4 days, actually, this question of how much to tell Gideon and when. Too soon, and she sounds like a woman making accusations she can't support. Too late, and something happens that she could have prevented. "He was unpleasant," she said carefully. "He asked me my business," I told him. "He told me you couldn't afford strays." She set down the shirt. "Is he someone I should know about?" Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. "He holds my debt." "What kind of debt?" "Cattle loan. Took out 2 years ago to rebuild the herd after a bad winter. I've been paying it down, but He stopped again. He did that, started sentences and then thought better of completing them, like a man who'd learned not to say too much out loud. He's called it due. Says I'm behind on the schedule. Are you? A long pause. I don't think so. But his numbers and mine don't match, and I can't figure out where the difference is coming from. She looked at him then. He was staring at the window, and the firelight was on one side of his face, and he looked tired in the way that people get when they've been carrying something heavy. For so long, they've forgotten what it feels like not to. Not defeated, exactly, but worn to a thinness that was starting to show through. Do you have the records? She asked. The original loan papers? The payment receipts? Somewhere he said it, in a way that meant yes. But I haven't looked at them in a while, because looking at them makes it real. I'd like to see them, she said. If you're willing. Kept my husband's books for 8 years. I'm not. She paused, choosing words carefully. I'm not saying I can fix anything. I'm saying I might be able to see where the numbers are falling apart. He looked at her. Why would you do that? It was a fair question. She thought about how to answer it honestly without saying too much. Because I'm sleeping in your storage room and eating your food, she said. And if Pike takes this ranch, my children are back on the road in November. He nodded slowly, that he understood. That was the language they both spoke, not sentiment, not charity, but plain self-interest, as clear and cold as winter water. I'll find the papers, he said. 3 days he brought her a wooden box. It was a chaos. That was the only word for it. Receipts stuffed in without order, some folded, some loose, some stuck together where something had spilled on them years ago. Loan documents, payment records, cattle tallies, invoices from the feed store and the blacksmith, and someone named Hooper who seemed to have supplied fence posts on 4 separate occasions. She spread everything on the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and she started sorting. She didn't find anything wrong that first night, or the second. She built herself a timeline, payment by payment, and it mostly held together, and she started to wonder whether she'd been wrong about Pike, whether he was just a hard businessman calling a legitimate debt, and the bad feeling she'd had on the road was just the bad feeling of a woman who'd learned to be suspicious of men with easy smiles. Then she found the discrepancy. It was small. Small enough that it would be easy to miss. That was almost certainly the point. A payment recorded in Gideon's receipts on the 14th of March, $1,879, for $42.01, she could match to a receipt in the box. In Gideon's handwriting, stamped paid. But in Pike's accounting statement, the same payment was recorded as $31, $11 missing. She sat with that for a moment. $11 wasn't much. $11 spread across a big debt was nearly invisible. You'd have to be looking for it specifically to find it. And you'd have to be the kind of person who organized chaos into timelines and matched numbers against each other until they either agreed or confessed. She pulled out every payment record she had and started checking them one by one. By midnight, she had found 6 discrepancies, none of them large, none of them dramatic, each one small enough to be explained away as a clerical error if you looked at it alone. But together they told a story. Together they said that someone had been shaving amounts off Gideon's payments, recording less than he'd actually paid, letting the difference accumulate quietly in the space between what Gideon thought he owed and what Pike said he owed. And if Gideon's debt was larger on paper than it was in reality, then the foreclosure Pike was pushing for was built on numbers that weren't true. She sat back in her chair. The fire had gone low and the kitchen was cold, and the only sound was the wind outside working at the house again, looking for the same gaps she'd been sealing all week. She thought about what she had. She thought about what she didn't have. She thought about a man who smiled while he told a woman to get off a road, and the way he looked at Maze without seeing her, most of its windows, and the particular confidence of someone who has never been caught because he has never been careful enough to be caught. She thought about what would happen if she was wrong. And then she thought about what would happen if she was right, and she said nothing. She got up and found the piece of charcoal and a clean flour sack, and she started copying. Not just the discrepancies, everything. Every payment, every date, every number, both what Gideon's receipt said and what Pike's statement said. She made a second copy. Then she hid one copy in her room, inside the lining of her suitcase where the broken latch had torn a small gap in the leather. And she put the other copy back in the wooden box and put the wooden box back on the table. She didn't wake Gideon. Not yet. She needed more. What she had was suggestive. What she needed was damning, and a woman making accusations against the most powerful man in Redwater Crossing was going to need a great deal more than a widow's arithmetic before anyone listened to her. That calculation, that clear, cold knowledge that being right wasn't going to be enough stayed with her through the next weeks as Briar Hollow began slowly to change. It's hard to say exactly when a dying thing starts to turn around. It's not a single moment, it's more like small corrections. A stove that burns more evenly because someone took the time to clean out the chimney. A chicken coop that doesn't lose birds anymore because the wire's actually tight. A vegetable patch that produces late turnips and carrots because someone got seeds in the ground before the freeze. Lenora started selling eggs in town. This was not a grand enterprise. It was 4 dozen eggs a week, bartered at the general store for things the household needed. Flour and salt and lamp oil. But it was 4 dozen eggs a week that hadn't existed before, and it added up with the butter she'd started making from the milk of Gideon's 2 remaining dairy cows. Most of its windows were dark, and the bread she began baking in double quantities and selling to 2 families in Redwater Crossing who didn't have time or flour to make their own. She never mentioned the money to Gideon without a full accounting. Every transaction written down. What came in, what went out, what stayed. She left the ledger on the kitchen table where he could see it whenever he wanted, and she never asked him to look at it, and he never acknowledged looking at it, but she could tell when he had because the numbers were sometimes checked in a different hand. It wasn't that she was trying to show him up, it was that she needed him to understand, spumdat, without her having to say it outright, that this was possible, that the land he was standing on was not as lost as he thought. Because Gideon Thorne, she had come to understand, was a man drowning in his own certainty that he was already finished. Not lazy, not weak. In fact, he was one of the hardest working men she had ever seen up before dawn, working until past dark, doing the labor of 2 men without complaint. But there was something in him that had stopped calculating forward. He managed what he had without imagining what it might grow into, which, in her experience, was the thing that killed farms before the debt did. She found out about the other families by accident. She was in the kitchen at the back of the day, putting away a sack of flour she'd brought back from town, when she heard Gideon come in through the front. She heard him cross the main room and go to the storage shelf near the door where he kept extra supplies. And she heard, very distinctly, the sound of something being removed and the front door opening again. She went to the window. He was loading a small sack flour, she thought, and something wrapped in paper into his saddlebag. Then he mounted up and rode south, which was away from town. She didn't say anything that night. She waited. 2 days later, it happened again. This time she watched him go, and she asked Caleb casually whether he knew who lived south of the Thorne property. Caleb had made friends faster than she'd expected. He had his father's quality of being easiest to talk to when he was doing something with his hands, and he and Samuel had been repairing fence sections for a week, and Samuel talked a great deal when he was working. So Caleb knew the landscape now. The Aldrich place, he said, and further down, the Myers family. Samuel says the Myers have had a hard year. Mr. Myers hurt his back and couldn't work the last of the harvest. Lenora nodded and said nothing else, but she thought about what it meant, a man who couldn't pay his own debts, quietly redistributing the food he couldn't spare to families who had even less. She thought about the hidden tin in the kitchen cabinet, and she thought about the cattle weights in Pike's ledger, and she thought about what kind of man Orson, Pike thought Gideon Thorne was. Easy prey, most likely. A man too honorable to be careful and too proud to ask for help. She understood then that what she was dealing with was not a debt problem with a complicated solution. It was a predator who had found a specific kind of victim and built a mechanism to extract everything from him while he was busy being too decent to notice. She started paying closer attention to everything. She started noting how often Pike's men rode past the property. Too often, she thought, for men who had no business there. She noted the name of the sheriff in Redwater Crossing, a man called Hollis, who she'd seen twice having dinner at the saloon where Pike usually sat. She noted which families in the valley had debts held by Pike's lending company, and which of them had stopped coming to church in the fall, which was often the first sign of a family too ashamed of their circumstances to face their neighbors. Started talking to women, not about any of this, not directly. just talking. The way women talk, in kitchens and at the store and at the well, the casual exchange of information that men never quite categorize as intelligence gathering because it doesn't look like anything in particular. She talked to the woman who ran the laundry on Main Street, who knew everything about everyone, because people's clothes told stories. She talked to the wife of the man who owned the feed store, who extended credit and knew which ranchers were struggling to pay it back. She talked to an older woman named Mrs. Garfield, who lived in a small house at the edge of town and had, Lenora eventually determined, the sharpest memory of anyone in Redwater Crossing for dates and numbers and the precise timing of other people's misfortunes. Mrs. Garfield was the one who told her about the Calloway family. Lost their ranch 2 winters ago, she said, over tea that Lenora had brought as a token of the visit because Mrs. Garfield was lonely in the particular way of a woman who used to be important and had stopped being visited. Biggest spread in this part of the valley once. Horace Calloway was a good man. Pike had the debt. By the time Horace understood what had happened to his numbers, the property was already gone. What happened to the family? Lenora asked. Left. Oregon, I think. Or they meant to. I don't know if they made it, Mrs. Garfield looked into her tea. Horace said the payments didn't match. Said he had receipts that proved he'd paid more than Pike's books showed. But nobody listened to him, because what was a struggling rancher's word against Orson Pike's bookkeeper? Lenora kept her face very still. Did Horace keep his receipts? She asked. He did. Took them to the county office. Man there looked at them for about 10 minutes and told Horace to take it up with a lawyer in the city seat. Mrs. Garfield set down her cup. Horace didn't have money for a city lawyer, so he lost the ranch. Who was the man at the county office? Mrs. Garfield looked at her for a moment, with the particular attention of an older woman noticing something she hadn't expected. Deputy County Recorder, she said. Name of Fenn. He retired the following year. Moved to a new house. A pause. Nice house. For a deputy recorder. Lenora walked back to Briar Hollow with her head full and her face composed and her hands steady at her sides, and she thought about timing. She thought about how much she knew. She thought about how much she could prove and whether those two piles were close enough yet to be useful. Not yet, she decided, but getting closer. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing yet, was that Pike was not waiting for a natural timeline. He had his own calendar, and it was running faster than hers. She found that out on a Tuesday in late October, when a rider came to Briar Hollow with a sealed letter. She was in the yard when he came, and Gideon was in the barn, so she was the one who took the letter from the rider. Without quite meaning to, she just reached up and took it, the way you take a thing that's being handed to you, and he didn't object and rode away. She looked at the envelope. Gideon Thorne, Briar Hollow Ranch, urgent. She didn't open it. She wasn't about to open his mail. But she held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was not the weight of paper, but the weight of whatever bad thing was inside. Then she went to the barn. Gideon was repairing a harness, and he looked up when she came in, and he must have seen something in her face, because he set the harness down, scenes, before she even said anything. She handed him the letter. He opened it. Read it. Read it again, slower. The silence in the barn lasted a long time. He's moved the date, Gideon said. His voice was very flat. The flatness of someone controlling something carefully. Foreclosure proceeding. He's saying I missed a payment in September. Did you? No, he looked at the letter. I paid it. I have the receipt. She thought about the tin in the kitchen cabinet. She thought about a deputy recorder who retired to a nice house. She thought about Horace Calloway driving toward Oregon with a box of receipts that nobody listened to. Gideon. She waited until he looked at her. I need to tell you something I've been sitting on for 3 weeks. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the letter down on the workbench very carefully and he said, Tell me. So she did. Not all of it, not Mrs. Garfield and Fenn and Calloway, not yet. Just the numbers. The discrepancies she'd found in his records, small amounts across multiple payments, adding over time. The pattern that only looked like error if you saw each one alone, and looked like something else entirely when you laid them out in order. She watched his face as she talked. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He stood very still with his hands loose at his sides, and she saw the moment it settled into him, not with anger, not right away, but with a kind of sick recognition, like a man who has been feeling that something was wrong for a long time and has just been given the word for it. How much? He said. If I'm reading it right, he's overstated your balance by somewhere between $80 and $100 over 2 years. She paused, which is not the difference between a man who can pay and a man who can't, but it's the difference between a payment schedule that's manageable and one that looks like it's always slightly behind. He was quiet for a very long time. I need to see a lawyer, he said. Yes. She hesitated. But Gideon, you need to understand something. I talked to a woman in town who knew a rancher Pike did this to before, to the county office, and got nowhere. Because the man in the county office, Fenn, Gideon said. She stopped. You know about Fenn? Expected. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she'd come to recognize as what he did when something was worse than he'd expected. I didn't have anything solid. Neither does anyone else. Separately. She kept her voice steady. But separately is the problem. If it's just you, it's your word against Pike's books. If there are other families with the same pattern in their records, there are. She looked at him. I know there are. He looked at the letter on the workbench. I've heard enough from enough people over enough years. I just never had. He stopped. Nobody ever sat down and actually looked at the numbers. Most of its windows were dark. The words landed in the space between them, and neither of them said anything for a moment because they both understood what the words meant and what they didn't mean, and how strange it was to be standing in a barn with a woman he'd known for 3 weeks, feeling more seen than he had in 3 years. I should have done it myself, he said finally. You were running a ranch alone, she said. You were also, she added, because he needed to hear it even if he didn't want to, feeding half the valley on a budget that couldn't support it. He looked up sharply. I've seen you, she said, simply, without judgment. The South Road twice. The Myers family misses. Aldrich. She paused. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying it's part of how he got ahead of you. You were looking outward. He was looking straight at you. Gideon stood there in the dim barn, with the light coming through the boards in narrow lines, and she could see him doing what a person does when they realize they've been outmaneuvered, that sick, angry, retrospective calculation of all the moments you could have seen it coming and didn't. He wants to take this land, Gideon said. It came out low and deliberate, like a statement of fact rather than an emotion. Yes. He thinks he can because he thinks I don't know what he's doing. Yes. And he thinks nobody around here would listen even if I did. Lenora looked at him steadily. He thought that about the last man too, she said. The last man didn't have his receipts organized. And the last man was alone. She let that sit. The wind moved against the barn wall. One of the horses shifted in its stall, and Gideon Thorne stood in his own barn, on the land that 3 generations of Thornes had broken their backs on, and his jaw was tight and his eyes were sharp, and for the first time since she'd come through that gate, he did not look like a man that's accepting a loss. He looked like a man who had just decided not to. What do you need? He asked. More receipts, she said, from other families. Ones who'll trust you enough to show them to me. She held his gaze. And time. We have to move faster than he does now. He nodded. It was an agreement, not warm, not dramatic. Just 2 people who had each other's measure, now standing in a cold barn with a deadline letter on the workbench rate, deciding that they were not going to accept what was being arranged for them. Outside, the light was going late and gold across the yard, and somewhere in the house, Maisie was calling for her mother. And Gideon's daughter Ada was answering, before Lenora could, telling Maisie that her mother was in the barn, and supper wasn't ready yet, and here, come help me set the table. Neither Gideon nor Lenora heard it. They were already talking about numbers. But it happened. The morning after Gideon read that letter, he rode into Redwater Crossing before sunrise and came back 3 hours later with his jaw set and his eyes flat in the way Lenora had learned meant something had gone wrong that he hadn't anticipated. She was in the yard splitting kindling when he rode in. She didn't ask. She waited. He dismounted and tied his horse and stood there for a moment with his hand on the saddle like he needed something solid to hold on to. I went to see Alderman Cruce, he said. Cruce was the only man in Redwater Crossing who called himself a lawyer, though his practice ran mostly to property surveys and wills. Told him about the discrepancies. Showed him the letter from Pike, and Gideon looked at her. He said it sounded like a contract dispute. Said I'd need to demonstrate a pattern of fraud, not just arithmetic errors, to challenge the foreclosure in court. Said I'd need a lawyer from the county seat, probably, and that would He stopped. More than I have. Lenora set down the axe. Did he say anything else? He said I might want to consider whether I was reading the numbers correctly. A pause that had something hard in it. He said Pike's bookkeeping has always been found satisfactory by the county. By Fenn, she thought. By a deputy recorder who retired to a nice house. She didn't say that out loud. Instead, she said, "How long do we have?" He's filed for a hearing. 42 days. She counted it against what she knew, what she had, what she still needed. It was enough time. Barely enough time, with no margin for anything going wrong, which in her experience meant it was not quite enough time. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated, and there was something in his voice that was half disbelief, and half she didn't know exactly what. Not hope. Too early for hope. Something more like the recognition that she wasn't going to tell him it was hopeless, and that meant he wasn't going to let himself say it either. She picked up the axe again. "Go check on the Myers family today. Tell Daniel Myers you need to see his payment records. Don't tell him why yet. Just say you're trying to sort something out, and you think it might affect more than just your property. He'll trust you," she said. "You've been leaving food on his porch for 2 months. He knows your character." She split a log. "We need his records, and we need the Aldriches, and if you can think of anyone else who's had trouble with Pike's numbers, we need theirs too." Gideon nodded slowly. "Then what are you going to do?" "I'm going to go see Mrs. Garfield again," she said. "And then I'm going to go through everything one more time. Every number, every date. I want it tight enough that a county judge can't dismiss it in 10 minutes." He was quiet. Lenora, the first time he'd used her given name. She noticed but didn't react. If this goes wrong, if we put these families' records forward and Pike counters somehow, and the hearing doesn't go our way, then we're no worse off than we are now, she said. He's already trying to take this land. The question is whether we make him work for it or just hand it over. She looked at him directly. "I don't hand things over." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he untied his horse and swung back into the saddle. "I'll be back before dark," he said. She watched him ride out. Then she went inside and spread everything on the kitchen table again, and started from the beginning. Problem with the records, and she'd been circling this problem for days without quite solving it, was documentation. Her copies were copies. Gideon's receipts were originals, which was good, but receipts in a man's own handwriting could be challenged. What she needed was something in Pike's own records that contradicted Pike's accounting. Something that showed not just that the numbers were wrong, but that someone had deliberately made them wrong. She spent 2 days on it and found it on the 3rd. She almost missed it. It was buried in a stack of papers at the bottom of the wooden box. Underneath the oldest invoices, a statement that Pike's company had sent in the spring of 1878, before the disputes had really started, before Gideon had begun to fall behind. An early statement, a routine one, showing the original loan balance and the payments received to that point. She put it next to the most recent statement. Then she got out her copies of Gideon's receipts. The early statement matched. Every payment, every amount, every date matched perfectly to what Gideon had paid. No discrepancy in 1878. Pike's own early paperwork confirmed that Gideon had been paying correctly, had been paying on time, and that the balance had been reducing at exactly the rate it should have been. Discrepancies started in 1879. Specifically, she traced it twice. To be certain, they started 3 months after Fenn retired from the county recorder's office. She sat back and looked at what she had. She was looking at a timeline. A deliberate, careful, patient timeline. Pike had run the scheme honestly at first, or honestly enough while there was someone at the county office who might have actually checked the records. Then, when Fenn left, when whatever arrangement had existed between them was no longer necessary, or perhaps when Fenn took his payment and removed himself, Pike had started adjusting the numbers. Slowly, a little at a time. The way you turn up the temperature on something you don't want to startle. The early statement was the key, because it was in Pike's own handwriting, on his company's paper, with his company's seal, and it told a story that directly contradicted what his current books were claiming. She pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed. Then she picked up the charcoal and started making the cleanest, most careful copy she had ever made of anything in her life. Gideon came back that evening with 2 things: Daniel Myers' payment records which Myers had handed over with shaking hands and a look on his face like a man who has been waiting for someone to finally say out loud what he'd been afraid to name, and a piece of information that he delivered standing in the kitchen doorway. Still in his coat, because he hadn't been able to wait long enough to take it off. Stopped at the Aldrich place on the way back, he said. Clara Aldrich told me something. Lenora looked up from the table. What? Pike's been talking to people in town, saying I brought a woman onto the property, a stranger, a widow with children, unknown character, and that I've been letting her go through my business records. He paused. He's saying you might be feeding information to someone, competitor, or he's not specific. He's just planting the idea. She held that for a moment. It was elegant, she had to admit. If people in Redwater Crossing started wondering about her character, started asking who she was and where she'd really come from and why a woman would take such an interest in a man's financial records then, anything she produced would be tainted before it was read. The fraud case would turn into a story about an untrustworthy widow, and Pike would walk away, shaking his head at the unfortunate situation. How much did Clara say he'd told people? She asked. Enough. The saloon mostly. Men talk there. Men talk everywhere, she said. So do women. She looked at the papers on the table. He's scared. Gideon frowned. He's trying to undercut you before you can. I know what he's doing. But he wouldn't bother if he didn't think we had something. She tapped the early payment statement. Come look at this. He came to the table and leaned over, and she walked him through it, the 1,878 statement, the 1,879 divergence, the pattern of small reductions across 2 years, and finally the numbers side by side showing what he had actually paid versus what Pike's current books claimed he had paid. Gideon was very still while she talked. When she finished, he straightened up slowly. He did this on purpose. Yes, from the beginning. From before he stopped. Elizabeth got 6 in the spring of 1,879. I wasn't watching things as carefully. I had other things on my mind. She didn't say anything. Some things don't need commentary. He knew, Gideon said. Not a question. I don't know if he knew specifically, she said carefully, but I think he looks for moments when a man isn't watching, when he's got grief or debt or illness in the house. He's patient. She looked at the papers. Patient men are harder to catch than reckless ones. Gideon pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked at the table with the expression of confronting something they'd known was coming and finding that it still hits harder than you expected. My father built this land, he said. 30 years. He built it for me, and You didn't lose it, she said. Not yet. Because of you. Because we found it in time. She sat down across from him. Don't make Kit something it isn't. I need you practical right now, not grateful. There's still a great deal that can go wrong. He looked at her for a moment with something she didn't have a category for yet, and then he nodded. All right, what's next? The Myers records took her 2 days to go through, and what she found was exactly what she'd expected and dreaded in equal measure, the same pattern. Different amounts, slightly different timing, but the same fundamental mechanism payments as understated, balance overstated, the debt quietly engineered to always stay just out of reach. Daniel Myers hadn't been behind on his payments. He'd been behind on a version of his payments that existed only in Pike's ledger. She wrote everything down. Clean, organized, dated. She built a document that showed Gideon's case and Myers' case side by side. The same pattern in both sets of records, starting in the same year. Then she added what Mrs. Garfield had told her about Horace Calloway, which she couldn't prove with documents, but which fit the pattern with a precision that was not coincidental. Then she did something that cost her a long night of sitting with the decision before she made it. She wrote a letter to the county seat. Not to a lawyer, she couldn't afford a lawyer, and she knew it. She wrote to the county land records office directly, requesting confirmation of the official record of debt discharge for the Calloway property in 1878. A formal request, politely worded, citing her interest as a party to a current proceeding in Redwater Crossing. She didn't tell Gideon she was sending it, not because she was hiding it from him, but because if it came back empty, if the county records had been tidied as thoroughly as the local ones, she didn't want him to have spent hope on it. She sent it with a rider going east on the Wednesday mail. Then she went back to work. The next 2 weeks were the closest thing to warfare that she'd ever experienced without anyone drawing a weapon. Pike moved. First, he sent a man to the general store with a story about unpaid accounts that Gideon supposedly held there, which wasn't true, but which caused the store owner to be awkward with Lenora the next time she came in to trade eggs, and caused 2 families she'd been supplying with bread to stop their arrangements quietly and without explanation. Lenora replaced the bread customers within 3 days by approaching 2 other households directly. She didn't make an issue of it. She just kept moving. Gideon moved second. He rode to every family in the valley that he knew personally, and he asked a simple question: had their accounts with Pike ever seemed to not add up? He didn't accuse anyone of anything. He didn't push. He just asked, and then listened, and what came back to him over 4 days was a quiet, accumulating weight of people who said yes, they'd thought so, but they'd assumed they were wrong, because how do you tell a man like Pike that his books are lying? 3 families agreed to bring their records to Briar Hollow. They came separately on different days because Lenora had specifically asked Gideon to arrange it that way. She didn't want a gathering that looked like an organization. She wanted individual conversations that she could document individually. Each one sat at her kitchen table while she went through their papers. Each one watched her work with the same expression, part disbelief, part the particular relief of having a thing you've been afraid to name finally named by someone else. Thomas Aldrich, Clara's husband, was a big, quiet man who looked at his boots the whole time Lenora was going through his records and said very little. When she finished and showed him what she'd found, he was quiet for a long moment and then said, "I told Clara the numbers were wrong. She told me I was probably just tired from the harvest." "She was protecting you," Lenora said. "Trying to." "I know," he rubbed his face. "What do we do with this?" "We build a case," she said. "And when the time comes, you decide whether you want to be part of it." "What does being part of it cost me?" She was honest with him. "I don't know yet. It depends on how the hearing goes. But doing nothing costs you your land eventually. So you're choosing between a risk you take and a loss you're handed." He sat with that. "I'll talk to Claire," he said. He came back 2 days later and said yes. The night that felt like everything might fall apart came in the second week of November. Ada woke Lenora at what must have been 2 in the morning. The house was cold and completely dark, and Adis was standing in the doorway of the storage room with a candle and a face that was trying very hard not to show fear, and not quite succeeding. "There's men outside," Ada said. "On the road, I could hear horses." Lenora was out of the cot before Ada finished the sentence. She pulled on her boots and her coat and said, "Go back to your room and close the door. Don't open it unless I tell you. Where's Papa?" "Still asleep. Go." She didn't go directly to wake Gideon. She went to the front window first. There were 2 men on horseback out on the road beyond the fence. Not doing anything, just there. Not moving. Sitting in the dark like they were waiting for something, or like they wanted someone inside the house to know they were being watched. She stood at the window for a full 2 minutes without moving. Then she went and woke Gideon. He came alert fast, a farmer's habit, the ability to go from sleep to upright with very little transition. She told him what she'd seen in a low voice, and he went to the window and looked, and she watched the muscles in his jaw go tight. "Men," he said. "Probably." She kept her voice even. "They're not doing anything. That's the point, they're just there. To put us on edge before the hearing. Or to see if we panic and do something that looks bad." She turned away from the window. "Go back to bed." He looked at her. "If you go out there, it becomes a confrontation," she said. "If you stay in here, it's 2 men sitting on a public road doing nothing. Let them sit." She paused. "They'll leave by dawn." He stood there for a moment in the dark kitchen, and she could see him wrestling with it, the rancher's instinct that says, you don't let men park themselves outside your fence line, without answering it, versus the cooler calculation she was offering. She could see which part of him wanted to win. Her voice was quiet. "I know, but please." He breathed out slowly. "All right," he said. They sat at the kitchen table in the dark, not lighting a lamp because she didn't want to give anyone outside the satisfaction of knowing they'd disrupted the house. She made them both coffee by feel, using the coals in the stove, and they sat and drank it and didn't say much. At one point he said, "You're not afraid." She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I'm afraid," she said. "I'm just used to it by now." A pause. "Are you?" "Yes." He said it without embarrassment. "Been afraid since Elizabeth died. Different kind of afraid every year. First it was just, how do I do this? Then it was finances. Then Pike." He stopped. "Now there are more people involved," she said. "Yes. He looked at the dark window. Myers, Aldrich. If this goes wrong at the hearing, it doesn't just go wrong for me. I know, you know, and you're still. Yes, she said. He was quiet. He asked. And it wasn't a simple question. It wasn't just asking why she was helping him. It was asking something larger than that. Something about a woman who had arrived with nothing, taking on a fight that wasn't technically hers. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the farm outside Coleridge and the bank, and the morning she'd walked away with 2 children and a suitcase with a broken latch. Thought of its windows were dark. She thought it felt like to lose something that someone else had deliberately taken from you versus something that circumstance had taken. The difference was enormous. The difference was the difference between grief and fury. Because I know what it looks like when someone takes a thing from you that they have no right to, she said. And I've got a particular problem with standing by when I can see it happening. Gideon looked at her across the dark table. Thomas was lucky, he said, to have you. He'd have argued about it regularly, she said, but he'd have meant yes. She looked down at her cup. He was a good man, not a careful one. I handled the careful parts, and then you lost him, and then I lost him. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, because there was no other way to say it that didn't make it worse. And I learned that careful doesn't protect you from everything, but careless makes it easier for people like Pike to find their opening. The horses outside the fence line were still there. She could hear them, faint and occasional, one of them shifting its weight on the frozen ground. He thinks he's already won, she said. Maybe he has. He hasn't. She set down her cup. The early statement, the Myers records, the Aldrich records, that's 3 sets of documentation showing the same pattern. I'm writing it up as a single account. Not Gideon Thorne versus Pike, not Daniel Myers versus Pike, a pattern of fraudulent accounting across multiple properties over multiple years. Gideon was watching her. I'm sending a copy to the county records office, one to the state land board, and one to a newspaper in the capital that I wrote to last week. She met his eyes. Pike has arrangements locally. He does not have arrangements everywhere. The silence stretched. A newspaper, Gideon said. They print land fraud stories. People read them. It makes it harder to make a thing quietly disappear when it's already been written down somewhere. He exhaled. When were you going to tell me this? I'm telling you now. You've been stopped. Start it again. You've been running this hole. You've been 3 moves ahead the entire time. And you haven't. I tell you what you need to know when it's solid enough to be worth knowing, she said. I'm not keeping things from you to be secretive. I'm keeping them until I'm certain, because the last thing we need is to get your hopes up on something that doesn't pan out. He looked at her for a long moment in the dark kitchen, and she had the same feeling she'd had in the barn of being read accurately, completely, by someone who saw past the competence and the steadiness to the woman underneath, who was, in fact, terrified, who checked and rechecked her copies every night, because if she made a single mistake, if one number was wrong, the whole thing could be turned against them. Who knew exactly what happened to women who accused powerful men and failed. She did not say any of that, but he sat with it anyway, like he could hear it. The letter to the county records office, he said finally. When will you hear back? Any day. I sent it 3 weeks ago. He nodded slowly. They sat in the dark kitchen until well past 3 in the morning, and sometime around 4 for the sound of horses on the road stopped, and the night was quiet again. Gideon went back to bed. Lenora did not. She sat at the table with her papers and her copies, and she worked. The letter from the county came 4 days later. It was delivered to the general store's town, which was where she'd directed it, and the store owner handed it over with the careful neutrality of a man who didn't want to be involved in whatever was happening, but also didn't want to be rude about it. She thanked him and walked out and didn't open it until she was 3 blocks down the street, standing next to the hardware store where nobody she recognized was likely to be looking. She opened it. The county records office confirmed the discharge of the Callaway property debt. Standard language, routine. But attached to the confirmation was something she hadn't expected, a note from a junior clerk, handwritten, apologetic in tone, saying that in the process of locating the Callaway record, he had found several irregularities in the supporting documentation that he had flagged for review, and that if she was engaged in a proceeding that involved related parties, she might wish to present her evidence directly to the district land board rather than to the local hearing. She read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully and put it in her coat pocket and walked back to the road. The district land board, not the local hearing. Over Pike's head, over whatever arrangements he had locally, past whatever influence he held in Redwater Crossing. She thought about the 42 days. She counted what was left. 21, tight, very tight. She went straight to Gideon's and she did not walk slowly. He was in the barn when she came in, and she handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. His expression stayed controlled, but something in his eyes changed. The district land board, he said, yes. We'd have to travel. Petition in person, most likely. I know, and if they don't, Gideon. She looked at him steadily. I've been building this case for 6 weeks. I have the early statement. I have your records. I have the Myers records, the Aldrich records, and now I have a county clerk who found irregularities in the Callaway file that he put in writing. She paused. I have enough. It's not going to be simple. It's not going to be without risk. But we have enough. He looked at the letter in his hand. At the barn around him, the stalls his father had built, the beams that had been there before he was born. What do you need from me? He asked. I need you to ride to Myers and Aldrich today and tell them we're going to the district board, she said. I need to know if they'll come forward formally. Not just give me their papers, actually come forward. They'll be scared. They already are. The question is whether they're more scared of Pike or more scared of losing what they have. She held his gaze. You know these men. What do you think? He thought about it honestly. She respected that about him. He didn't give the optimistic answer or the reassuring one. He actually thought about it. Myers will come, he said. Got less to lose. Bank's already close on him. A pause. Aldrich, he stopped. I'll talk to Thomas, but Clara's the one he listens to. Then talk to Clara. He looked at her for a fraction of a second with something that might have been surprised amusement, except that Gideon Thorne did not do amusement easily. Then he went to saddle his horse. She went back to the kitchen table. She had 21 days, and a case and a fractional alliance of frightened families, and a man who was learning slowly, and not without struggle, to let her carry half the weight. She had a county clerk's letter that could be dismissed or could be the key that opened a larger door. She had children in this house who were sleeping better than they had. In a year, Ada and Maisie sharing a room now, and Samuel showing Caleb how to read a cattle count, and the whole house running on a rhythm it hadn't had in 3 years. She had all of this, and she had 21 days, and she was not finished. Outside, November was bearing down on the valley like it meant it. The sky had the flat white color that precedes serious weather, and the wind was different than it had been lower, steadier. The kind of wind that doesn't stop because it's not just passing through. It's settling in. She looked out the window for a moment, thought about the fence on the north side that Caleb and Samuel still hadn't finished reinforcing, thought about the cattle, how Gideon had been managing them with the changed grazing pattern she suggested 2 weeks ago, how they'd put on some weight, but were still thin. She thought about a great many things in a short amount of time, the way a person does when they can feel the world compressing around them. Then she looked back at her papers. 21 days. She picked up the charcoal. What she was writing now was not a summary. It was not a simple count of discrepancies. It was something she'd been building in her head for weeks, structured the way her father had taught her to structure an argument, not with anger, not with accusation, but with sequence. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, and here is the documentation for each step, and here is what it means when you lay it all out in order. Patient man had built a patient trap. She was going to dismantle it, the same carefully, piece by piece, in an order that a judge or a board member or a newspaper editor could follow without needing her to explain it. And somewhere down the road in Redwater Crossing, Orson Pike was having his evening in his usual chair at his usual table, comfortable in the knowledge that the hearing was 3 weeks away, and the rancher at Briar Hollow had no lawyers and no money, and nothing but a widow's arithmetic to show for himself. He had not adjusted for Lenora Vance yet. He would. But not tonight. Tonight he was comfortable, and tonight she was working, and the distance between those two facts was exactly what she needed to protect. She worked until the candle burned low, and then she lit another one and kept going. The blizzard came without adequate warning. That was the thing about early winter in that valley. The sky could lie to you for days, flat and white and cold but manageable. And then something shifted in the air pressure overnight, and by morning, you were looking at conditions that had nothing manageable left in them. Lenora had grown up, reading weather the way her mother had taught her, watching the way animals moved and the way wood expanded in the door frames and the particular quality of silence that preceded serious storms, but even she hadn't caught this one early enough. She noticed it wrong at supper on the 14th of November. The cattle had been restless all day, not the restlessness of hunger, which she knew by now, but something edgier, a constant low-level anxiety that moved through the herd like a current. She'd mentioned it to Gideon at the table, and he'd nodded. Said he'd noticed it too, said he'd checked the north fence line in the morning because the last thing they needed was animals pushing through into the open country if weather came. He said it the way you say a thing you mean to do. By 3 in the morning, the wind had picked up to something that wasn't a sound so much as a pressure, and Lenora lay in the storage room and listened to the house, responding to it, the boards shifting, the window frames complaining, the particular high note of wind finding the gap in the east corner that she still hadn't fully sealed. She got up to check on Maisie and found her daughter already awake, sitting up in the dark with her blanket pulled around her shoulders. Bad? Maisie asked. Probably, Lenora said. Stay in bed. I'm going to check the stove. The stove was fine. Problem was the window in the main room, which had developed a crack sometime in the night along the lower left pane, not broken through, but starred, and letting in a thin, constant knife edge of cold that was working against everything the stove was doing. She packed a cloth against it and wedged it with a piece of kindling and told herself she'd deal with it properly when there was light. Gideon was already up when she came back through. He was standing at the front door looking out at what the night had become, which was a wall of moving white that the lantern light caught and made into something almost beautiful if you didn't know what it meant. North fence, he said. In the morning, she said. The cattle are already moving. I can hear them. She could too. The low, uneasy sound of animals that know something is wrong and haven't yet decided whether to run from it. In the morning, she said again, you can't see a hand in front of your face right now. You'd be riding blind. He stood at the door for a long moment, and she watched his profile in the dim light, the tension in his shoulders, the specific weight of a rancher's calculation, animals against weather, risk against loss. She knew what he was thinking because she'd watched Thomas make the same calculation 100 times. Cattle weren't just money. They were the whole structure of what you were building. Lose enough of them in one night, and the recovery could take years. First light, she said. The moment there's light, I'll have coffee ready and we'll assess. He closed the door. All right. But first light brought conditions that were worse than dark. The snow was horizontal, and the wind was running somewhere between 40 and 50 miles an hour, by Lenora's estimation, which was an estimation she'd made, standing in the doorway for 30 seconds, before the cold forced her back inside. She could barely see the barn from the porch. Gideon looked at it and said, I'm going. She didn't argue this time. She'd used up her argument at 3 in the morning, and now it was different. She could hear the cattle herself, and they were further away than they should have been. And the sound had the particular quality of animals in motion rather than animals in distress, which meant they'd already found the weakness in the fence and gone through it. Caleb goes with you, she said. He's 14 and he knows the north fence better than anyone because he spent 2 weeks on it. She was already moving, pulling Caleb's coat from the hook. You rope together. You don't separate for any reason. If visibility drops below what you can manage, you turn around, cattle or no cattle. Gideon looked at her. Promise me, she said. It wasn't a gentle request. She held his gaze with the directness of a woman who has already calculated the worst-case version of this morning and is asking him to help her not arrive at it. I promise, he said. She woke Caleb. Her son was out of bed in the quick way of a boy who'd spent weeks earning his place in this ranch and was not about to waste a moment now. He pulled on his layers without complaint, face serious, and went to Gideon at the door, and the two of them roped together at the waist. Gideon's idea, she noted. He'd already been thinking the same thing she had and went out into the white. Lenora stood at the door and watched them disappear into the storm in about 15 seconds flat. Then she went back inside. Ada was in the kitchen with Samuel and Maisie, and the three of them had the particular stillness of children who understand that something serious is happening and have decided that the most useful thing they can do is stay out of the way. Ada was keeping the younger two occupied with something a card game, it looked like, though nobody's attention was entirely on it. Is my father all right? Ada asked. He will be, Lenora said, which was the answer she chose over the true answer, sir, which was, I don't know. She spent the next hour doing what she always did when she was frightened, which was work. She reinforced the window. She stoked the stove. She started a pot of soup because hot food would matter when they came back. She checked the water supply because if the storm lasted past today, they'd need to manage carefully, and she did all of this with the part of her brain that handled practical problems while the other part listened, constantly, for the sound of the door. An hour passed, then another. The storm didn't let up. If anything, it got heavier around mid-morning, the kind of escalation that makes you revise your estimate of how long this is going to last. Lenora was at the window, the repaired one, looking north when Samuel said quietly, "They should be back by now." He was right. She didn't tell him that. Different things take different amounts of time in weather like this, she said. Father knows what he's doing. He does, Samuel agreed. But he stopped. She looked at him. 10 years old, trying very hard to be steady because the women in the room were being steady, and he'd decided that was the right response. Thomas's son would have done the same thing. It made her chest hurt in a place she didn't have time for. I'm going out to look, she said. Ada stood up. You stay here, both of you, and Maisie, you stay in this house. If I'm not back in 30 minutes, Ada, you go to the barn and ring the bell until someone comes. Understand? Ada nodded. Lenora put on everything she had, every layer. Her coat on top of a shawl on top of her heaviest shirt, and she wrapped a wool scarf around her face, and she went out. Cold was a physical thing. Not the kind of cold you complain about, the kind that tells you clearly and without sentiment that it does not care whether you survive it. She felt it through her coat in the first 30 seconds, and she leaned into the wind, and she moved toward the north fence because that was the north fence. That was the direction Gideon and Caleb had gone, and that was the only direction she had. She went along the fence line, because in whiteout conditions, a fence line is the only thing that tells you where you are. She kept one hand on the posts, moving from one to the next, and she didn't think about anything except the next post and the cold and the listening. Listening hard past the wind for a voice or a sound or anything that wasn't weather. She found Caleb first. He was crouched next to a fence post about 200 yards north of the house, and for one terrible second before he turned his face toward her, she thought he was hurt. But he was upright, and his eyes were clear, just frozen looking, his breath coming in visible bursts, and he grabbed her arm when she reached him. He's down, Caleb said. His voice was steady. She was proud of him for that, and frightened by it at the same time. Horse went over something, through him. He's about 50 yards further. Couldn't move him alone. Is he conscious? He was. He told me to go back to the house. A pause. I didn't. Good boy, she said. Show me. Gideon was lying aside in the snow, and the horse was nearby with its head down, and one foreleg held at an angle that was immediately and obviously wrong. Gideon had his arm pressed against his side, and his face was the color of the sky, not white. Exactly, but drained of anything warm, and there was a line of dried blood at his temple that the snow was already covering. Gideon. She crouched next to him. How bad? Arms broken, he said. His voice was controlled but thin. Left side ribs, maybe. Can breathe. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not fear, exactly, but the honest acknowledgement of someone who has just understood how close a thing can come. The horse? We'll deal with the horse. Can you stand? If you help me. Getting a man of Gideon's size up off the ground in those conditions was one of the hardest physical things she'd done since she'd left Ohio. He outweighed her by a considerable margin. His left arm was useless, and every time he put weight on his left side, he made a sound that he was clearly trying not to make and failing. Caleb took his right side, and she took his left, and they moved him upright by stages. And he swore once a single sharp word that he immediately apologized for, and then he was up. Don't apologize, she said. Walk, he walked. It was not walking in any normal sense. It was a series of controlled movements through resistance, the three of them leaning together against the wind, following the fence line back, because there was nothing else to follow. Lenora kept her hand on Gideon's back, and she counted fence posts in her head, and she did not think about how far they'd come or how far they had to go, because that kind of thinking wasn't useful right now. At some point, Gideon stopped making sound, which scared her more than the swearing had. Talk to me, she said. About what? His voice was distant. Anything. The ranch. What you're going to plant in spring. Pause. Corn, he said. Southfield. Lenora said the soil. He stopped. Lenora said the soil what? You said the Southfield soil was better than I was using it for. That's right, she said. Keep going. What else? More chickens. He exhaled, and it was ragged at the edges. Ada wants a dog. She mentioned that to me, Caleb said from his other side, and Lenora was grateful to her son, beyond any words she had available, because he understood instinctively what was needed and was providing it without being asked. Gideon said. A big one, Caleb said. She didn't specify further. Big dogs eat a lot. You can afford it. Your Southfield corn is going to do very well, despite everything. Despite the cold, and the broken arm, and the cracked ribs, and the whiteout in the horse and still. Out there, on the frozen ground, Lenora felt something shift in her chest. Something small and involuntary. Not quite a laugh. The ghost of one. They reached the house. Ada had the door open before they got to the porch. She took one look at her father and went white, and then immediately went to get blankets, which was exactly the right response, and the response of a girl who had been running a household under difficulty for 3 years, and knew that panic was something you could do after the immediate problem was handled. They got Gideon to the main room and onto the settle, and Lenora assessed the damage with the practical efficiency of a woman who had set her own brother's broken wrist when she was 17 and had watched enough injuries on a working farm to know the difference between serious and critical. The arm was broken clean through the forearm. She could feel the displacement through his sleeve. The ribs on the left side were at least 2 cracked, possibly 3. The cut on his temple was shallow and had mostly stopped bleeding. I need wood, she said to Samuel, for a splint. Clean pieces, straight as you can find. Samuel went. I need the whiskey, she said to Ada. Your father keeps a bottle somewhere he thinks nobody knows about. Ada looked at her for a moment, and then went to the kitchen and came back with a bottle from behind the pickle jar that Lenora had noticed weeks ago and filed away for exactly this kind of occasion. Gideon looked at the bottle and then at Lenora. You knew. I know everything that happens in this kitchen, she said. Drink. He drank. She set the arm while he was distracted by the whiskey and the cold. He said a great many words that she didn't acknowledge. Caleb held his shoulders. Ada kept the younger children out of the room. When it was done, Gideon lay back against the settle cushions and looked at the sea-seeking with the expression of a man who has just understood that today could have ended very differently. The horse, he said. We'll see to the horse. If the leg is we'll see to it. She didn't elaborate. The horse's leg was badly broken, and there was only one ending to that, and it was not the kind of thing you talked about in front of people who were already having a difficult morning. Rest. I can't rest. Is in 9 days, she said. You have 9 days to rest. She looked at him directly. Papers are ready. The case is ready. I sent the district board petition 2 days ago with a full copy of the documentation. She kept her voice level and factual, the way she knew worked best with him. There is nothing for you to do today except stay still and heal. He looked at her. 9 days, she said again. He closed his eyes. She let herself take one breath that was slightly less controlled than the others. Then she went to deal with the horse. The next 3 days were the kind of days you survive rather than live through. Storm ran its course and left behind a valley. So buried and still, that sounds carried strange distances. You could hear a dog bark from the Myers place, half a mile off, like it was in the next room. Gideon ran a fever for 36 hours that scared her more than the broken arm had, and she sat with him through the worst of it, keeping cold cloths on his forehead and making him drink water he didn't want, and listening to him say things in the half-conscious way of a feverish person that she didn't repeat to anyone. He called for Elizabeth once, just once and briefly, and then he was quiet again. Lenora changed the cloth and didn't say anything. When the fever broke on the 3rd morning, Gideon opened his eyes and looked at her sitting in the chair beside him and said, How long? 3 days, she said. He absorbed that the hearing. 6 days. He tried to sit up. She put a hand on his chest and pushed him back, not gently. You are not going to the hearing like this. I have to. You don't have to do anything except not die of a fever you've just finished having. She took her hand back. I'm going. He stared at her. Lenora, I have the documents. I have the original receipts and the copies and the early statement and the Myers records and the Aldrich records and the county clerk's letter. She looked at him without flinching. I have everything. And I know it better than you do because I built it. The hearing board will expect. A man, she said it flatly without particular emotion. I know that. And they'll be surprised to find a woman instead. But surprised isn't the same as wrong, and I'm not asking the board to approve of me. I'm asking them to look at the numbers. She paused. Numbers don't care who presents them. The silence was long. Gideon's face was the face of a man having several simultaneous arguments with himself, which she recognized because Thomas had worn the same face on multiple occasions. The argument between what he thought he should be doing as the man of the ranch and what she was plainly right about. The argument between pride and sense. Myers, he said finally. And Aldrich, they're coming? Myers, yes. Aldrich Thomas said yes last week. I'll confirm before I leave. They'll want to see me. They'll see you when this is over. She held his gaze. I need you to trust me. It landed between them differently than she'd meant it, or maybe exactly as she'd meant it. She wasn't sure. Trust wasn't a word they'd used with each other directly. They'd built it in other ways, in work and evidence, and the accumulation of things that had been said and proved over 10 weeks. But saying it out loud was different. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. I do, he said. I do trust you. And he said it the way he said most true things, without decoration, as a statement of fact that he'd already verified before saying. She nodded, stood up, rest. You keep saying that. Because you keep trying not to. She picked up the cloth from the basin. Is there anything about the case I don't know that I should know before I go? He was quiet for a moment, which told her he was thinking about it seriously rather than just answering. Pike knows someone on the district board, she said. Harlan Dodd. They were in business together years ago. She processed that, which means even at the district level, we can't assume a clean room, she said. No, all right. She thought about it. Is Dodd the chairman? No, second chair. The chairman is a man named Reeves. I don't know him. I'll find out what I can before the hearing. She started for the door. Lenora. She turned. Be careful, he said. Pike, he paused, and she could see him deciding how much to say. He's done things I haven't told you. Not just the numbers. There was a man in the valley 3 years back who tried to organize. Moved away after that. People thought it was just circumstances. He met her eyes. It wasn't circumstances. The weight of that sat in the room. I'll be careful, she said. She wasn't certain she believed herself. The ride into Redwater Crossing, 2 days before the hearing, was the first time she'd left Briar Hollow alone since she'd arrived, and she felt the absence of the house behind her more than she'd expected. Not the absence of safety, she'd never felt entirely safe there. Something else. The absence of a place that had come to feel, without her exactly intending it, like hers. She went to see Mrs. Garfield first. The old woman had been following developments with the sharp, hungry attention of someone who has lived long enough to know that most injustices are never addressed, and is therefore intensely interested in the ones that might be. Dodd, Lenora said, setting down her tea. Tell me about Harlan Dodd. Mrs. Garfield settled back in her chair. Harlan Dodd is a man who has been ambitious for 30 years without ever quite having enough spine to get where he wanted to go, so attached himself to people who would get him there instead. She considered. He's loyal to Pike because Pike has been useful to him. He is not a true believer. He is a calculator. Could he be moved if the evidence was strong enough? Mrs. Garfield looked at her for a long moment. If the evidence made supporting Pike more dangerous than abandoning him? Yes. Harlan Dodd will not sink with a ship he can step off of. Lenora thought about that on the walk to the general store. She thought about it while she confirmed her arrangements with the Myers family. Daniel Myers, now looking less frightened than he had, and more like a man who had decided that being afraid was something he was tired of, which, in her experience, was the best possible version of a frightened person. She thought about it that evening in the room she'd rented at the boarding house for 2 nights, a small cold room with a window that looked out at the back of the hardware store, while she went through the documents one final time. Yet its windows were dark. She had spread everything on the narrow bed, and she went through it in order, the way she'd have presented it if she were explaining it to herself from the beginning. The usually statement, clean and legible, Pike's own paper showing the original accurate balance. Gideon's receipts, each one dated and signed. The comparison document, 2 columns, what Gideon's records showed versus what Pike's records claimed, the discrepancy calculated per entry and totaled at the bottom. Then the same for Myers, then the same for Aldrich. Then the county clerk's letter with its careful apologetic language about irregularities in the Callaway file. And then, at the end, the document she'd saved for last, because it was the most recent and the most specific the response she'd received 6 days ago from the state capital newspaper, which had written back to say that a reporter named Garvey was interested in the story and would be attending the hearing. She had not told Gideon about the reporter. She had not told anyone. She'd mentioned the newspaper in passing weeks ago, and Gideon had not followed up, and she had not volunteered the update. Garvey's presence changed the dynamics. It meant that whatever happened in that hearing room would not stay in that hearing room. It meant that Dodd's calculation about whether to support Pike or step away from him would include a variable that local power did not usually have to account for witnesses from outside the valley, with printing presses. She put the documents back in order and wrapped them in the oilcloth she'd been carrying them in since the night of the storm. Then she lay down on the narrow bed in the cold room and she thought about Gideon lying in the settle at Briar Hollow with his broken arm and his cracked ribs and his fever-pale face, and she thought about Maisie sleeping in the room she now shared with Ada, as though she'd always been there. And she thought about Caleb, who had not flinched in a blizzard and held a man's shoulder through a broken bone, and would grow up to be someone she was very proud of. She thought about the gate, open, not broken on that first day. A man who couldn't make himself close it. She did not sleep well, but she slept. The morning of the hearing, she woke at 4:30 without needing to be woken, the way she always did, and she dressed carefully. She wore the best of what she had, which wasn't much her dark dress. The collar mended so precisely you had to know where to look to see it. Her hair pinned up in the way that took time but held all day. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, and she noted, without vanity or false modesty, that she looked like what she was, a woman of plain means who knew exactly what she was doing. That would have to be enough. She arrived at the hearing room early. It was a room at the back of the county land office building, which in Redwater Crossing meant a room with 3 tables, several chairs, a window that let in gray morning light, and the particular smell of a space that handles disputes, paper and ink, and old anxiety. There was a board table at the front set for 3, and a table on one side for parties presenting, and a row of chairs along the wall where she assumed the gallery would sit. She set her documents on the presenting table, and she sat down. She was alone in the room for nearly 10 minutes. Then the door opened, and Orson Pike walked in. He was with 2 other men she didn't recognize, associates or lawyers of some kind, well-dressed, carrying their own leather cases. Pike looked at the room and then at the table where Lenora was sitting, and for just a moment something coved across his face that might have been surprise. Then it smoothed out. "Mrs. Vance," he said, as if he'd been expecting her. As if this were a social call. "Mr. Pike," she said. He looked at the documents on the table in front of her. His eyes moved over them with the quick, assessing quality she'd noticed the first time she'd seen him on the road. That speed of calculation. "Where's Thorne?" he said. "He was injured in the storm last week," she said. "I'll be presenting his case." Pike smiled. It was the same smile from the road, the one that didn't reach anything above his mouth. "You'll be presenting his case," he repeated. And the repetition was not confusion. It was condescension wearing the costume of repetition. "That's right," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then turned to speak to one of his associates in a low voice, and she could see by the set of his shoulders that he was not troubled. He was interested, maybe, in the novelty of it, but not troubled. That was fine. She looked at her documents and did not look at him. Myers came in 10 minutes later, hat in hand, with Clara and Thomas Aldrich behind him, Clara holding Thomas's arm in the way of a woman who has made up her mind and is steadying her husband through his own making of it. They nodded to Lenora. She nodded back. The reporter Garvey came in last, thin and quick-eyed, with a notebook already in his hand. He found a seat along the wall and looked at the room with the particular expression of a man who has been to many of these proceedings and is deciding whether this one will be interesting. Lenora thought it would be interesting. The board members filed in at 9 o'clock. Chairman Reeves, a compact, gray-haired man with the deliberate manner of someone accustomed to being lied to and has developed systems for detecting it. A woman named Stroud who handled land records, which Lenora hadn't known and was quietly pleased by, and Harlan Dodd, who was exactly what Mrs. Garfield had described a man of medium everything, wearing the careful expression of someone calculating continuously. Reeves settled into his chair and looked at the room. His gaze moved from Pike's table to Lenora's table, and he raised one eyebrow very slightly when he found a woman's sitting where he'd presumably expected Gideon Thorne. "We are here," he said, "to hear the matter of the foreclosure petition filed by Orson Pike's lending company against the property known as Briar Hollow Ranch, currently held by Gideon Thorne." He looked at Lenora. "Is Mr. Thorne represented?" "Yes," she said. "My name is Lenora Vance. I'm presenting on Mr. Thorne's behalf. He was injured in the recent storm and cannot travel, but I have his written authorization to present his case, and I have the documentation of our position." Reeves looked at her for a moment. "You're not a lawyer, Mrs. Vance." "No," she said, "I'm not." She looked at the board table steadily. "But I am the person who organized, verified, and built the case, and I am the person who knows it best. Most of its windows were dark, and I believe when the board has seen what I've brought, the question of my qualifications will seem less relevant than the question of what the documents say." Reeves looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. "Proceed." Pike presented first. It was what she'd expected: clear, confident, competently delivered by one of his associates. Presentation of the loan terms and the payment schedule, and the claim that Gideon Thorne had fallen behind by an amount that had made foreclosure the appropriate remedy. The associate was good. The documents were neat. The argument was coherent. She let it finish without reacting. Then Reeves looked at her. "Mrs. Vance." She stood up. She had spent 11 weeks building what he was about to say, and she did not rush it, and she did not perform it. She laid the documents out in the order she'd decided on, and she walked the board through them, the same way she'd walked through them alone in the cold room. The night before the early statement first, Pike's own document, establishing what the accurate picture looked like, before the adjustments began. Then Gideon's receipts, original and dated. Then the comparison, side by side, entry by entry. She didn't editorialize. She didn't accuse. She let the numbers do what numbers do when they're arranged honestly in order. At the third discrepancy, Stroud leaned forward. At the sixth, Reeves made a note. Dodd was watching Pike. She got to the Myers records, and she watched the room change, because one set of discrepancies can be a counting error. Two sets in the same pattern, starting in the same year, running the same mechanism, that's something else. She could feel it in the room, the shift in weight, the moment when something goes from being an allegation to being a question that requires an answer. She presented the Aldrich records. She presented the county clerk's letter. She set them all down on the board's table in the precise order she'd laid them out. And she stepped back, and she said, "What I have shown you is not a payment dispute. It is a pattern. It is the same adjustment mechanism applied to 3 separate properties over 2 years. The early statement shows you what Pike's own books looked like before this pattern began. The receipts show you what was actually paid. The difference between those two things is not a clerical error." She paused. "I also want to note," she said, "that these 3 families are not the only ones who have experienced this pattern. A 4th property, the Callaway Ranch, was foreclosed 2 years ago under certain circumstances that appear consistent with what I've shown you today. County Records Office has flagged irregularities in that file." She looked at the board, at Reeves, at Stroud, at Dodd, who was no longer watching Pike. She noticed. He was watching Reeves, calculating. "I am asking this board to halt the Briar Hollow foreclosure proceeding and to refer the full matter to the State Land Board for investigation." The room was quiet. Pike's associate stood up and began to say something about unverified documents and irrelevant comparisons, and the reputation of his client's firm, and he said it fluently and confidently, and Lenora sat down and let him talk, because she'd already said what she came to say. Reeves let the associate finish. Then he looked at the documents on the table in front of him, Pike's neat presentation on one side, her ordered stack on the other, and he looked at Pike for a long moment, with the expression of a man who has been to many of these proceedings and has developed systems for detecting lies and is running them now. "Mr. Pike," he said, "this early statement, this is your firm's document?" Pike stood. His voice was even, controlled. "It is. But the comparison being made is based on It's your document, Reeves said. Not aggressively. Just clarifying, dated sealed in your firm's hand. Yes. Reeves looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the comparison Lenora had made. Dodd said nothing. He was looking at his hands. Reeves looked up at the room. We'll recess for 30 minutes, he said. Pike and his associates went into the hall. Myers and the Aldriches stayed in their seats. The reporter Garvey was writing very quickly in his notebook. Lenora sat at her table with her hands folded and she waited. The 30 minutes felt like a season. When the board came back, Reeves sat down and looked at the room with the deliberate calm of a man who has made a decision and made peace with it. The foreclosure proceeding against Briar Hollow Ranch is suspended pending review, he said. The documentation presented today raises sufficient questions regarding the accuracy of the creditor's funds inside. This board cannot in good conscience authorize the transfer of property. He looked at Pike. Mr. Pike, your firm will provide a full accounting of all payment records for all properties currently under lending agreement to be reviewed by the State Land Board. A pause. The matter of the Callaway property will also be referred for separate investigation. The room was very quiet. Lenora looked at the table in front of her. At the oilcloth now empty, she heard Dodd say something to Reeves in a low voice that she couldn't quite catch. She heard Clara Aldrich make a small sound that might have been a breath let out after being held for a very long time. She heard Garvey's pen moving. She did not hear Pike say anything. She looked up. He was standing at his table, and he was looking at her, and his face was a thing she would remember for a long time, not the anger. Exactly. Though the anger was there, carefully managed the way everything about him was carefully managed. What she would remember was the surprise. The genuine, unguarded, specific surprise of a man who has built a world on the assumption that certain people will not see him and has just been seen. She held his gaze. She did not smile. She did not look away. After a moment, he turned and picked up his leather case and walked out of the room, his associates moving behind him like a tide following the moon, and then he was gone. And Lenora Vance sat at a table in a cold room in Redwater Crossing, and she breathed. And outside the window, the November sky was the same flat white it had been all week, and somewhere behind her, the Aldriches were talking to the Myers, and the reporter was moving toward her with his notebook, and none of it had quite settled into real yet. She thought of Gideon at the settle in Briar Hollow. She thought of the gate, standing open. She thought of what she was going to tell him when she got back, and how she was going to tell it, and whether his face would do the thing it sometimes did, that shift behind the control, the thing he thought he was hiding, when he understood that it had worked. She answered the reporter carefully and briefly, and then she gathered her things and she stepped out into the cold air, and she went to get her horse. She had a long ride home, and there was still a great deal of work left to do, and she was very tired. But she pointed herself north toward Briar Hollow, and she rode. She rode back to Briar Hollow in the cold and the quiet, and the whole way she kept waiting to feel something definitive triumph, maybe, or relief, or the clean satisfaction of a thing finished. What she felt instead was tired. Not the tired of a body that needs sleep, though she needed that too, but the deeper tired of someone who has been running on urgency for so long that, when the urgency lifts, all the weight that urgency was holding up comes down at once. The sky was still flat white. The road was frozen hard under the horse's hooves. Her hands inside her gloves were cold despite the gloves, and she thought, not for the first time, that she needed better gloves before February got here. February. She was thinking about February as though she'd be here for it. She noticed that and held it for a moment, examining it the way you'd examine something you found in your pocket that you didn't remember putting there. When she came through the gate, Ada was in the yard. The girl had clearly been watching the road. She was standing near the fence post in her coat, with her arms crossed against the cold, and when she saw Lenora coming, she went very still for a moment, and then came forward with the particular restrained urgencies of someone who has been told not to run. Well, Ada said. Lenora dismounted. Her legs were stiff. The hearing board suspended the foreclosure. Ada stared at her. Pending investigation, Lenora said, which means it's not finished yet. There will be more steps. But Pike won't be taking this land. Not today. Not through that proceeding. Ada stood there in the cold, and for a moment She looked exactly like what she was 12 years old, and trying very hard to be older, and then something in her face gave way, and she turned and ran toward the house, calling for her father, and Lenora watched her go and felt something pull in her chest that she couldn't have named precisely. She tied the horse and followed. Gideon was sitting up when she came in. He'd moved himself from the settle to a chair at the kitchen table, which she knew because she could see where the effort had cost him in the tightness around his eyes. Ada was standing beside him with her hand on his arm, and Samuel was in the doorway, and Maisie was at the floor near the stove, and Caleb was leaning against the wall with the particular expression he wore when he was trying to contain something that didn't want to be contained. They were all looking at her. She set her bag down, took off her coat, hung it on the hook she'd been using since the first week. Foreclosure is suspended, she said. The board is referring Pike's accounts to the State Land Board for investigation. The Callaway case is being looked at separately. Gideon said nothing for a moment. His face was controlled in the way she knew by now, not because he wasn't feeling anything, but because he felt things in a way he needed to process before he showed, and showing happened later, if it happened at all. The board believed the documents, he said. They believed the documents, she said. Reeves especially. He's a careful man. The early statement was the thing that moved him. He couldn't dismiss it because it was Pike's own paper. And Dodd? Dodd watched which way Reeves was going and stepped off the ship before it sank. She thought of Mrs. Garfield's assessment. Calculators calculate. He won't be a problem. Gideon looked at the table. Assessments. She could see him running the same assessment she'd been running on the ride home, what this meant and what it didn't mean, what still needed doing, how much of this was finished, and how much was only beginning to resolve. There'll be more hearings, he said. Yes, the investigation will take time, maybe months, but they can't foreclose on you while it's running, and once it's running, other families will come forward. She paused. Garvey was there, the reporter. He was writing when I left. Gideon looked at her sharply. I didn't know about a reporter. I know you didn't. A long silence. When were you going to tell me, he said. When it was solid enough to be worth knowing, she said, which was the same answer she'd given him weeks ago about the county records request. And she could see by the expression on his face that he remembered that too. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He stopped, started again. You make decisions about information like you're rationing supplies. I'm rationing supplies, she said. I always has been. Hope is a supply. You can't spend it on things that might not pan out. He looked at her for a long moment. Thank you, he said. He said it the way he said true things plainly, without decoration, as a fact he'd already verified. She knocked down. Is there coffee? Ada made coffee. Samuel set the table. Caleb carried in wood without being asked, and Maisie got up from the floor and came to lean against Lenora's arm in the way she'd been doing for months, a small, warm weight that Lenora had stopped noticing consciously because it had become part of the ordinary texture of days. They sat around the table, all 5 children and Lenora, and Gideon with his broken arm splinted and his ribs making themselves known. Every time he breathed too deeply, and they drank coffee and ate the bread Ada had made, and nobody said anything for a while, and the fire in the stove crackled, and outside the flat white sky started to go gray with the early dark. It was not a triumphant scene. It didn't feel like the ending of something. It felt like a room full of people who had all been through something hard and were still in it but could see, maybe, the shape of a way through. That was enough. That was, in her experience, what most good things actually felt like from the inside. The weeks that followed were complicated in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. The investigation, once it began, had an energy of its own that was both useful and difficult to manage. Garvey's article ran in the Capitol paper 2 weeks after the hearing, and it was careful and factual, and it named the pattern with the precision of someone who had read Lenora's documentation thoroughly, which he had, because she'd made him a copy before she left Redwater Crossing. The article named Pike, named the mechanism, described the 3 families by initials only. Most of its windows were dark, and mentioned the Callaway foreclosure by name because the Callaways were no longer in the valley and couldn't be harmed by it. It was, she thought, a good piece of work. Not sensational, not performed. Just the thing as it was, laid out clearly enough that a reader could follow it. It ran on a Wednesday. By Friday, 2 more families in the valley had come to Briar Hollow with their records. Not to her, specifically to Gideon, because they knew Gideon and didn't know her, and Gideon received them at the kitchen table and looked at their papers, and then brought them to Lenora, and Shewitt's windows were dark, and she went through the records while the family sat and watched, with the particular mixture of shame and relief that people carry when they've finally told someone about a problem they've been too embarrassed to admit was happening. The shame was the part that troubled her most, actually. Both the Langley family and old Martin Keel had believed, on some level, that their trouble with Pike's numbers was their own fault, that they were the ones who hadn't been careful enough, hadn't been smart enough, hadn't kept proper records. The idea that it had been done to them deliberately, systematically, by a man who relied on exactly that shame to keep them silent, she could see them sitting with that revelation like something that hurt and helped at the same time. It wasn't arithmetic, she told Martin Keel, who was 63 and had spent 3 years wondering where he'd gone wrong. He knew you'd assume it was your error. That's why it worked. Martin looked at her with the eyes of a man receiving something he'd needed for a long time. I kept thinking I must have miscounted somewhere. You didn't, she said. I've been through every entry twice. He nodded. He didn't say anything else for a moment. Then, my wife thought the same thing I did, that we'd been careless. Tell her she wasn't. He took his records home and he told her. Lenora found this out 3 weeks later from Clara Aldrich, who had heard it from someone else, which was how information moved in a valley like this, slowly and in circles, but it got there. Pike's first move after the article ran was to hire additional lawyers. They filed motions challenging the state land board's jurisdiction, challenging the admissibility of documents presented by a non-attorney, challenging the inclusion of the Callaway case in the investigation on the grounds of timing. Each motion bought him days. Some bought him more than that. The investigation that Lenora had hoped would be moving quickly settled into the slow, grinding pace of formal proceedings, and there were weeks in December when it felt like they were making no progress at all. Gideon handled those weeks badly. He healed. Physically, the arm came along well, the ribs took longer, and there was a period in early December when he was physically recovered, enough to work. But the work wasn't enough to outpace the anxiety, and he carried that anxiety through the house, like weather, present and impossible to address directly. One evening, she found him outside at nearly midnight, standing at the fence line looking north, and she pulled her coat on and went out. It's not done, he said, without turning around, because he'd heard her coming and had probably expected her. No, she said. What if they find a way to, what if the motions work and the state board decides? Then we find another way, she said. That's all. There isn't a path through this where giving up early helps us. He turned around. His face in the cold moonlight was the face of a man who knows what he wants to say and is not entirely sure he has the right to say it. She'd been seeing that face more often lately and choosing not to comment on it, waiting for him to find his way to the edge of it in his own time. I need to say something, he said. All right. He was quiet for a moment. I've been stopped. Tried again. When Elizabeth died, I stopped. I stopped seeing the ranch the way I used to, like it was something to protect for the future. I just started seeing it as something to survive. One more season, one more winter, just get to the next thing. He looked out at the property. I stopped imagining what it could be. She waited. You didn't, he said. You came here with nothing, and you started imagining it right away. The chicken coop, the south field, the dairy herd. You could see it as something it hadn't become yet. I could see it because I wasn't carrying what you were carrying, she said honestly. It's easier to see forward when you're not also carrying 3 years of grief. Maybe, he said, but there's something else. He looked at her directly, with the particular steadiness he had when he decided to say a thing and was going to say it clearly. I look at this place differently now. And he paused. I look at myself differently. I don't know who that's about exactly. Whether it's the case and what happened, or whether it's Gideon. He stopped. I know what you're trying to say, she said. The night was very cold and very quiet. Far off, something moved the cattle, one of them shifting, a low sound and settling. I'm not sure She stopped herself. This was not the moment for the careful management of information. She'd been doing that for months, and it was the right approach for documents and strategy, and it was not the right approach for a man standing at his own fence line in December, trying to tell her something true. I'm not sure what I'm saying either, she admitted. I know I stopped thinking of this as temporaries somewhere around October. I know I stopped thinking about my brother in Kansas around the same time. He said nothing. He was listening in the way he listened completely, without interruption, with the full weight of his attention. I know that Maisie calls Ada her sister, she said. Not like she's decided to, like she just forgot that Ada wasn't. Samuel brought Caleb in from the cold last week, Gideon said quietly. Said he'd been working the fence line too long. She looked at him. He didn't tell me about it, Gideon said. Caleb told me. He said Samuel just showed up with extra gloves and told him to come in for food. A pause, like it was something he'd always done. The space between them in the cold dark was not uncomfortable. It was the space of people who have spent months learning each other through work and difficulty and honest argument and the occasional silence that holds more than speech does. I'm not, she started. I'm not the same as I was when Thomas was alive. I'm not sure I'm who I would have been if things had gone differently. I might be harder than I was. I'm definitely less patient with certain things. What things? Pretense, she said. Politeness that covers dishonesty. People who say they can't do things they just don't want to do. She paused. I'm not an easy person, I know that, he said, and the way he said it was not complaint or qualification. It was the same tone he used for everything he'd actually thought about and accepted. She looked at him for a moment. Ask me plainly, she said. If you have something to ask it plainly. I don't do well with things that circle. Something shifted in his face, the relief of someone who has been trying to find the right door and has just been told where it is. I would like you to stay, he said. Not because of the work, not because of the case, not because of what the ranch needs. Because, he stopped, breathed. Because I am better at being here when you're here, and I don't think that's a thing I'm going to stop being true. The cold around them was absolute and clear. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, I'll stay, she said. That's what you asked. He nodded. Very slowly. The nod of a man who has been braced for something and has received something different and is adjusting. That's what I asked, he said. They stood at the fence line for a while longer, not touching, not saying anything in particular, which was how they were with each other. The comfort wasn't in the display, it was in the presence, in the simple fact of another person standing beside you in the cold and not leaving. Then she said, Your arm's going to get stiff in this cold. It's already stiff. Come inside then. They went inside. January arrived the way January does in that country, with a finality that makes you revise everything you thought you knew about what cold meant. The investigation ground forward through the state land board's procedures, and Pike's lawyers filed 2 more motions, and both were denied. And in the 3rd week of January, a hearing examiner from the state capitol arrived in Redwater Crossing to review the original documents in person. Lenora met with him for 3 hours. His name was Caldwell, and he was a thin, precise man who read everything twice before commenting, which she respected. He went through her documentation the same way she'd built it in order, one piece at a time, and he asked specific questions that told her he understood what he was looking at. At the end, he said, The early statement is the critical piece. Yes, she said. Pike's attorneys are arguing that it represents an earlier version of the accounting that was subsequently corrected through proper reconciliation. There's no reconciliation document, she said. I've asked for it. They haven't produced one. Caldwell looked at her. You've asked for it. In writing twice. She slid a copy of both letters across the table. No response. He looked at the letters. Then he looked at her with the expression of a careful man who has seen something he expected to see and is not surprised and is also not dismissing it. How long did it take you to build this? He asked. From when I arrived at Briar Hollow? About 6 weeks before I had enough to show. Another 4 weeks building the full case. You have no legal training. No. But you kept your husband's books. 8 years, she said. And my father's before that. He nodded slowly. This is very well organized, Mrs. Vance. Thank you, she said. I'm told it's not enough to be right. You have to make it easy for the right person to see it. Caldwell almost smiled. Whoever told you that was correct. He left Redwater Crossing 2 days later with copies of everything, and the original documents went into a locked case at the county records office where Pike's people couldn't reach them. 3 weeks after that, the state land board issued its preliminary findings, which were not the final word, but were the clearest signal, yet of which way the proceeding was going. The accounting irregularities across multiple properties were confirmed as a pattern, The investigation was expanding to include all properties with active loans through Pike's lending company, and the Briar Hollow foreclosure was formally declared void, pending the full investigation's completion. Gideon read the formal notice at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he set it down and sat with his hands flat on the table and said nothing for a full 2 minutes, which the children understood enough to leave alone. Then he said, "It's over. The foreclosure is over," Lenora said from the stove. "The investigation isn't. Pike still has lawyers." "I know." He looked at the notice. "But this land isn't going anywhere." "No," she said, "it's not." He looked up at her, and whatever he would have said next was interrupted. Said Samuel coming in from outside with Caleb behind him, both of them snow-covered and arguing about whether a particular section of fence needed replacing entirely or just reinforcing, which was a very normal argument for a Tuesday in January, and Lenora listened to it with the half attention of someone who would need to weigh in eventually and was content to let it run for now. Maisie appeared from the hallway and climbed onto the bench beside Gideon without asking, which she'd been doing for months, and Gideon moved slightly to make room, without looking away from the boys' argument, which he'd been doing for months, and Ada came in last with flour on her hands from the bread she'd been making, and she looked at her father's face and then at Lenora's, reading the room the way she always did, and something relaxed in her shoulders that Lenora didn't think had ever been fully relaxed before. "Good news?" Ada said. "Very good news," Lenora said. Ada nodded, went back to her bread. It was not, as Lenora had told Gideon, entirely over. It was another 4 months before the state board issued its final findings, and those months contained their own difficulties. Pike's lawyers succeeded in complicating the Langley case, specifically, which caused Martin Langley 2 weeks of terror before the complication was resolved, and there was a period in March when Gideon received a letter that appeared to be a threat, oblique enough to be deniable, specific enough to be clear, and they spent a week deciding how to handle it before Lenora copied it and sent the copy to Caldwell at the state board with a brief accompanying note, and the lecture stopped. Small crises. The kind that don't make stories, but that cost sleep and steadiness, and the particular reserves that people draw on when they're already close to empty. Dusan Passoff. Orson Pike did not come to Briar Hollow. She had thought he might have thought he was the kind of man who would make a personal appearance at some point, to say something that couldn't be written down, to try to find the angle that documents and hearings and careful organization couldn't address. She'd prepared for it in her mind, planned what she would say, planned what she would not say. He didn't come. What he did instead, she heard from Mrs. Garfield in March, he began a quiet process of liquidating his holdings in the valley. Selling off loans, selling off properties he'd acquired, reducing his exposure in Redwater Crossing in the way of a man who understands that the ground under a particular enterprise has shifted and is calculating his exit while he still controls the terms of it. "He's running," Mrs. Garfield said, with a satisfaction that she didn't try to disguise. "He's managing his losses," Lenora said. "He'll do it somewhere else." "Perhaps." The old woman looked at her over the teacup. "But not here. Not to these people," she paused. "Because of you. Because of all of them," Lenora said. "Because Myers and Aldrich and Keel and the others came forward. They came forward because you made it possible to come forward." "Mrs. Garfield set down her cup. "I've lived in this valley for 40 years. I've watched Pike or men like Pike work through this country for all of it. They count on people being ashamed of needing help, ashamed of not catching it themselves. They count on people being alone." She looked at Lenora with the clear, unsentimentalized attention of someone very old, looking at someone younger who has not yet understood what they've actually done. "You made them less alone. That's the thing that beat him. Not the documents, not the hearing board. You made people less alone." Lenora sat with that on the walk home. She thought about it for a long time afterward. She thought about Thomas, who had been a good man and a careless one, who had needed someone to handle the careful parts. She thought about what she'd lost when she lost him, and what she'd found in the process of surviving the loss that she hadn't known she had. The capacity for a certain kind of cold, clear thinking that didn't stop when things got frightening. The ability to keep working when the thing you were working toward was not guaranteed. The understanding that doing nothing is not the same as doing no harm. She thought about Maisie's foot going through the porch step the first day, and the chicken coop, and the broken window, and the document spread on the kitchen table in the middle of the night. She thought about a man who left food on his neighbor's porch when he couldn't pay his own debt, who opened a gate to a woman he'd never met because he couldn't make himself close it, who said, "I do trust you," in a barn in November, like it was a fact he'd already checked. Spring came to the valley the way it always does, imperfectly, in fits and starts, one warm week followed by a cold snap that froze the early seedlings and required replanting. Lenora replanted. She'd learned not to count on weather. The Southfield corn went in the third week of April. Caleb and Samuel working the rows side by side with efficiency that didn't require instruction anymore. The dairy herd had grown by 3 animals over the winter, a calculated expansion that Gideon had initially thought too aggressive, and come around to by February. The chicken coop produced enough eggs now that they'd extended their supply arrangement to 4 households in Redwater Crossing, and were in the early discussions of a 5th. The debts were not gone. They were not pretending the debts were gone, but they were manageable, real, actual numbers attached to real, actual plans for paying them, rather than the manufactured emergency that Pike had spent 2 years constructing. The difference between a real debt and a manufactured one is the difference between a problem you can work and a trap you can't see. The state board issued its final findings on a Thursday in May. Lenora read the document twice at the kitchen table before she told anyone what it said. The findings confirmed fraudulent accounting practices by Pike's lending company across 7 properties over 5 years, including Briar Hollow, Myers, Aldrich, Keel, Langley, and 2 others she hadn't known about. The Callaway foreclosure was declared improperly obtained, and an investigation into restitution for the Callaway family was opened, which she understood would be slow and complicated and might not result in much, but which was something rather than nothing, and something was what it had been before. Fenn, the retired deputy recorder, was named in a separate referral to the county prosecutor's office. She didn't know what would come of that either, but she wrote down his name in the record she kept, because records were how you proved things had happened. Pike's lending company was ordered to provide restitution to active borrowers for the overstated amounts, a process that would run through the rest of the year at minimum. His ability to operate in the state was under formal review. The man, Gideon, had mentioned the one who tried to organize the valley 3 years ago and moved away. She thought about him when she read the findings. She didn't know where he'd gone or how to reach him, but she kept that name in her record too. She sat at the table after she'd read it twice, and she thought about what it meant and what it didn't mean, and she let herself feel, briefly and without performance, the full weight of how close it had been. How different things would look right now if she'd turned around at the gate. If she'd decided that the open door wasn't her business. If she'd kept the careful, cautious accounting of a woman who has learned that interfering costs too much. She was glad she hadn't. She brought Gideon the document when he came in from the south field at noon, his work coat with dirt on his hands, and the look of a man who'd been thinking hard about corn spacing. He took it and read it standing up because he hadn't sat down yet, and she watched his face. He read it once, then he looked up. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He set the document on the table, looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at her with the full, clear attention he had when he was about to say something he'd been sitting with for a while. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right, and I'm going to ask it plainly this time. No circling." "Good," she said. He was quiet for just a moment, not hesitating. She could tell the difference by now, but choosing words the way he chose everything, carefully, with the understanding that words, said, were in the record. "Marry me," he said, "not because the ranchess needs it, not because the children need it, because I want to build what's next with you, and I can't think of a version of what's next that makes sense without you in it." Kitchen was warm. Outside the window, the south field was full of green that hadn't been there last spring, and somewhere beyond the fence line, Caleb was shouting something to Samuel about the irrigation arrangement, and further away still, at the edge of what she could hear, Maisie and Sheenus Ada were doing something that involved a great deal of laughter. "Yes," she said, "same as December, the same plain word for the same plain thing." He nodded, not surprised. He'd known, she thought, the same way she'd known, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, through the accumulation of ordinary mornings and difficult evenings, and all the unremarkable days that, when you added them up, turned out to be the most important thing. I should say, he said, that I've been thinking about the west pasture. She blinked now. The fence there needs to come out and be rerun properly. I've been putting it off because the cost, Gideon, but the restitution payment from Pike's company should cover it, and if we time it with Gideon. She stopped him, not with irritation, with something that was close to what he'd given her in December, at the fence line, the small, controlled ghost of something that wasn't quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. He looked at her. Ask me about the west pasture fence tomorrow, she said. A pause. And then something happened on his face that she hadn't seen before, not quite, or maybe she had in pieces, at different moments, but not all at once. The control shifted, and underneath it was a man who was not managing anything, not calculating anything, not carrying anything in particular, just standing in his own kitchen in May, with his hands not quite clean, and his work still half finished, looking at a woman who had walked in through his open gate in March with a broken suitcase and 2 hungry children, and had rebuilt everything around him while he watched. Tomorrow, he agreed. They were married in September, a small ceremony at the Redwater Crossings Church Hall, because Ada asked for a ceremony, and Gideon said yes to Ada in most things, which was not always practical but was very much in his character. Myers and Aldrich and their families came, and Mrs. Garfield came, and Martin Keel came, and the ceremony was brief and unsentimental in the way both Lenora and Gideon preferred, and afterwards there was food that the combined household had spent 3 days making, and somebody, Samuel, she strongly suspected, put too much sugar in the cake, and it was wonderful anyway. Caleb shook Gideon's hand that evening, and Gideon said something to him that she didn't hear, and Caleb's face did something complicated that he didn't try to hide, which meant he was learning, at 15, that you didn't have to hide everything. And that seemed worth more to her than almost anything else that had happened all year. Maisie called Gideon Papa approximately 2 weeks after the wedding, not in any ceremonial way, just by accident, reaching for something at the table and saying it, without thinking, and then going very still when she realized. Gideon didn't make anything of it. He just handed her what she'd been reaching for and went back to his conversation with Caleb about the corn yield, and Maisie watched him for a moment, and then went back to her food, and that was that. Ada called Lenora by her first name, not Mama, and Lenora never suggested she should do otherwise. Some things are what they are. Ada had a mother. The fact that her mother was gone didn't change what she was owed, which was the accurate name for the person who had been there. The hard thing about survival is that it doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up in the morning and know that you've come through, that the thing that was trying to finish you has failed, that what's ahead is genuinely different from what was behind. It happens incrementally over many ordinary days, and you only see it clearly when you turn around and look at how far back the worst of it is now. Lenora turned around and looked sometimes. Not often. She was not given to looking backward as a general practice, but occasionally, in the early morning before the house woke up, when she was the only one in the kitchen with the stove lit and her coffee in her hand, she would look at the window and think about that first morning. Cold, the disorganized shelves. The sound of the wind finding gaps she hadn't yet located. All the gaps were sealed now. She knew where every draft came from and what it took to stop it. She knew the stove's personality and the house's moods and the way the cattle moved when weather was coming. She knew which of Gideon's silences meant thinking and which meant something was wrong and which were just silences, the kind that don't need filling. She knew that Maisie had stopped having the nightmares she'd had every week in Ohio after Thomas died. She knew that Caleb had started talking about whether the Thorne cattle operation could be expanded northward in 5 years, talking about it like it was his future to plan, and she thought that was probably the truest measure of the year, a boy who had arrived hollow-faced and burning with a helplessness he couldn't name, and had become someone who talked about the future in the first person plural. She knew that Gideon woke up differently than he had when she'd first come. She couldn't have explained exactly what was different, only that the weight he used to carry into the morning, the weight of a man who had stopped imagining things as something other than survival, was lighter now. Still worked hard. He was still not an easy man in the ways that matter for living with someone. He was slow to say what he was feeling. He made decisions that were too solitary. He had a stubbornness that on bad days reminded her of a mule, and on good days she recognized as the quality that had kept the ranch alive through 3 years of Pike's engineering. He was imperfect in specific, predictable, manageable ways, which in her experience was the best you could hope for from anyone. She was not easy either. She knew that. She was decisive in ways that ran ahead of consultation. She had a tendency to solve things before she told anyone she was solving them, which had saved them multiple times and frustrated Gideon an equal number. She kept certain fears very private, and private fears have a way of calcifying if you don't let anyone at them occasionally. She was working on that. Slowly, the West Pasture fence was rerun in October. It came in under budget because Caleb and Samuel did half the labor themselves, and the money saved went into a second dairy cow that Lenora had had her eye on since August. Gideon said she'd planned that from the beginning, and she said she hadn't, and they both knew she had. In November, a letter arrived from Oregon. It was from a woman named Ruth Calloway, daughter of Horse, written in a careful hand that suggested someone who had grown up writing on limited paper and hadn't wasted any of it. She had seen Garvey's article, reprinted in a Portland paper. She was writing to say that her father had kept those receipts for 2 years after they lost the ranches and then burned them because looking at them was too painful and he needed to stop. She was writing to say that the investigation's findings and the restitution process had reached them and that something was coming back that they'd believed was simply gone. She was writing to say thank you. Lenora read the letter twice, folded it, put it in the wooden box where she kept the documents, not the copies, the originals, still organized and dated and cross-referenced, though she hoped she'd never need them again. She kept them because she was a woman who kept records, and records were how you proved things had happened, and things that had happened should be provable. She thought about Horace Calloway burning his receipts. She understood why he'd done it. She understood the specific exhaustion of carrying evidence of an injustice that no one was addressing, and how there comes a point when the evidence stops being useful and starts being only weight. She didn't judge him for it, but she was glad she'd kept hers. She was glad she'd made copies of copies and sent them to places where people she'd never met could find them if they needed to. That was the thing about careful people, not that they don't get tired, they do. Not that they don't want to burn the thing and be done with it, they do. But they know that what you protect is what survives, and they're constitutionally unable to stop protecting the thing just because it's hard. She wrote back to Ruth Calloway, a short letter, honest in the way she tried to be honest, not performing either warmth or modesty. What happened to your father's ranch should not have happened. I am glad the record finally told the truth. I am glad you had somewhere to go. I hope the restitution amounts to something real and not just a number. She signed it Lenora Thorne and then looked at it for a moment. The name she'd been using for 2 months now, still slightly unfamiliar, still something she noticed when she saw it written. Then she sealed the letter and set it with the outgoing mail. The gate at Briar Hollow still hung the same way it always had. Not broken, not stuck, just open. The way someone had left it one morning and never gotten around to closing. Lenora had looked at it and thought about fixing it on approximately 40 separate occasions, and she hadn't, and she didn't think she would. Some things were better the way they were. She stood at it one evening in November, the anniversary of nothing specific, just a Tuesday, with the cold coming down and the last light going off the hills to the west, and she thought about what a person is before what happens to them and what they become after, and whether those were the same person or two people wearing the same name. She thought about a road, a man on a horse with a flat smile, 2 children behind her, one of them reaching for her hand, one of them angry at everything in a general direction, a suitcase with a broken latch. She thought about what she'd been looking for when she came through this gate, which was the simplest of human things, a place to get through winter, a roof, a way to feed her children, enough ground to stand on that she could figure out what came next. She had not been looking for any of this, which was, she supposed, the nature of the thing. You don't arrive at the most important places in your life with a map to them. You arrive because a gate was open, or because you were desperate, or because the alternative was the road in November with nowhere left to turn. You arrive because some things aren't found, they're stumbled into, sideways, by a woman who just needed somewhere to put her suitcase down. And then you stay, because it turns out you've been building the whole time, without knowing you were building. And what you've built is the thing you couldn't have planned for, the thing that doesn't have a word for it except home. She heard the door open behind her. Gideon came and stood beside her, which is where he stood when he wanted to be near her and didn't need to explain it. He looked out at the same hills she was looking at. Cold, he said. Always cold this time of year, she said. You didn't close the gate again. I know. He looked at her sidelong and she looked at him, and between them was all of it 10 months, and a broken arm, and a blizzard, and a box of documents, and a hearing room, and a reporter's notebook, and 5 children who had stopped counting each other and just started being, and neither of them tried to say any of it, because it was all already said. It was in the fence line and the south field and the stove that burned even now, because she'd learned its personality, and in the way he moved over to make room before anyone asked him to, and in the gate still hanging open like someone expected more company. Come inside, he said. Ada made something. In a minute, she said. He went. She stood at the gate a little longer, not for any reason, just because she felt like it, because the cold was something she'd come to understand rather than just endure, because the hills had a quality in this light that she didn't want to stop looking at yet. Then she closed the gate just this once, just tonight, and walked back up to the house where the light was on and somebody was laughing about something, and the door was warm when she opened it.